Good morning. I now call the February 14th, 2023 Special Administrative Briefing and Work Session of the Marion County School Board to order at 10 o'clock a.m. Please silence your electronic devices. And just before I ask the school board attorney to explain our rules for this work session, I did want to make everyone aware that the governor has asked that today, February 14th, 2023 at 10:17 a.m. that all residents of the state of Florida will pause for a moment of silence in honor and memory of the 17 innocent lives lost during the Marjory Stoneman Douglas incident on February 14th, 2018. So at 10:17 a.m. we will be pausing, and I do have an alarm set, so don't be shocked if that does go off at 10:17, but in honor and memory of those individuals. So I'll now ask Attorney Jeremy Powers to explain the rules for this work session.
Thank you very much. This work session is a public meeting as defined in Florida's Sunshine Law. The board is dedicated to full transparency in its meetings and its work. In compliance with the Sunshine Law, the board has adopted uniform meeting procedures, including the right for citizens to participate. The board will allow public comment regarding any work session item listed on today's agenda at the appropriate time. Speakers must fill out a request form and hand it to located in the lobby and hand it to the board clerk. After the board and superintendent have completed their discussion on a particular agenda item, the board clerk will call speakers' names in the order received. Each speaker will have 3 minutes. As required by the Sunshine Law, the board must maintain orderly conduct and proper decorum throughout the meeting. Speakers may criticize subject matter and decisions in a respectful manner, but not people. Finally, speakers must be very careful not to violate the privacy rights of others, especially students and their family members, by mentioning their names or other identifying information. Thank you for your attention to these important rules.
Thank you, Attorney Powers. We will now begin the work session with the Superintendent's Administrative. Good morning, Dr. Gullett.
Good morning, Chair, members of the board. Great to see you today. I have a very exciting announcement. I just received an email yesterday that we have been selected as the District of the Year from the Cambridge International Association. We are recognized of one of three. We are the medium-sized district, which is appropriate. And the reason for this honor is because we have increased access of our Cambridge curriculum to our students and sustained or improved student performance on those exams. I'm delighted to get this information and be able to celebrate the work of our principals and our teams, our teachers, everyone, in raising the bar for our students. It's quite an honor for this. So more to come, but I'm just really pleased to share that with you. So want to thank our team for all of their great work.
Thank you, Dr. Gullett. What an amazing announcement. Having 2 children myself in the Cambridge program, that makes me even more excited. So thank you so much for that. With that, do we have additional items?
No additional items. I would like to mention, if I may introduce the next item. We're ready to move forward. Okay, thank you, Chair. So we have Ms. Morant back here today, who's going to present the school staffing plan ratios for the 23-24 school year. And I do want to mention, board, that we have several of our outstanding principals in the audience. So it's a busy day in schools, and they're here on board to answer any questions directly from the field if you have any. So I want to thank, I see Mr. Johnson and Mr. Carlisle and Ms. Sino, who are here. And so when you are done with any questions of them, if we're going to let them go back to their buildings. I know they have a full agenda today. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you. Ms. Morant.
Thank you, and good morning, Dr. Gullett. Good morning, Chair Campbell and members of the board. I am back to share version 3 of the district staffing plan ratios for the 2023-2024 school year. Our goal today is to get the board's consensus on the staffing plan ratios so we're able to make any necessary changes and have the final draft prepared for vote at tonight's board meeting. The approval of the school staffing ratios tonight will help ensure we remain on schedule with the staffing timeline for 2023-24 school year. As we know, the ratios drive many other processes within the district. As I shared previously, Human Resources, along with the Chief Operations Officer, Chief Academic Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Director of School Choice, ESC Director, an Area Superintendent, and an elementary, middle school, and high school principal all made up the committee to develop the proposed staffing ratios. The members of the committee are all here today, and as mentioned, including our 3 principals that were on the committee, and as Dr. Gullett mentioned, they are here to answer any questions you may have prior to returning to their schools for the day. The committee met prior to the winter break to review the current staffing plan. We also reviewed staffing plans from other districts and established a wish list. The committee was then tasked with going back to their respective areas to gather additional information and to prioritize their needs. The committee met a second time after the break and created version 1 of the draft. The estimated cost of the initial draft totaled approximately $773,000. At the direction of the board, at the first work session, we revised the draft, which included updating the ratios for APs, guidance counselors, and guidance clerks to be the same across all levels, our elementary, middle school, and high school. The total for these adjustments, including the first draft, totaled a little over $1.5 million. At the last work session, a request was made to share additional funding costs in each category, as well as the cost difference with applying the ratios across the board, and then also with absorbing units that would be lost based on the proposed allocations. That information is summarized on the first page of version 3 of the staffing plan ratios. The total amount of additional costs, if we apply the ratios across the board, is a little over $4.6 million. If we absorb units and allow schools to keep current positions that would otherwise be lost based on the proposed staffing plan, the total additional cost would be a little over $5.3 million. The third version of the staffing plan ratio also includes bands based on the ELL population for ESOL. Ms. Shawana Hughes has joined us in the event there are specific questions related to this area. As I've shared in previous sessions, schools are able to request additional positions in addition to the positions they were allocated based on their ratios and have the request reviewed by the unit control team. The positions that are currently allocated to schools, in addition to the units allocated through their ratios, are provided as a handout to you for review and FYI. An additional note to remember is that there are positions funded from other funding sources that are not included on the staffing plan, such as cafeteria monitors, graduation facilitators, and homeschool liaisons. We've also included 2 documents that illustrate the funding sources of each position. One document is based on budgeted positions, and the other is based on actual filled positions as of February 1st. Please note that there are 98 paraprofessionals under referendum. 97 of them are kindergarten paraprofessionals. On the current, and that was based on the budget. On the current schedule as of February 1st, there are 109 paraprofessionals under referendum, and 91 of them are kindergarten professionals. We realize that not one size fits all, and that schools may have individual needs that are not addressed by the ratios. We will continue to remind principals that they have the opportunity to request additional units based on school needs. As a reminder, there is a plan to proactively add a float position to the budget for the 2023-2024 school year to be able to readily address these needs. As you review the proposed allocations, I would like to make a small correction to Fort McCoy. They will not lose a counselor as illustrated on the middle school side. However, with the proposed plan, they will still gain a counselor based on their elementary numbers. Lastly, before we begin diving into the proposed staffing plan ratios, I would like to note that the allocations are based on the 100-day attendance count and not our 23-24 projections, which would include potential zoning, retentions, and school choice placements. Allocations may change based on these official projections, which are inclusive of the other factors just shared. Finally, we will review the allocations again at the 10-day count and adjust as needed. If no questions, I would like to go ahead and begin. Okay, thank you. So some other dialogue that came from our previous meeting, previous work session, was about our behavior techs. So we have moved them to the ESC staffing plan and added that is based on specific student needs. And I would like to pause. The changes for version 3 you will see them in blue ink. So version 1 was red, version 2 purple, version 3 blue. But we'll see the staffing guidelines for ESC. We've moved the behavior text here. And with an addition that we're proposing of 10, that would equate to the $365,000. And we also updated the verbiage that's in that green block to actually illustrate what the practice that we have in place, so that a para-additional teacher may be considered based on student needs, and removing the percentages since that's not what we were currently following. Any questions prior to moving to middle school?
That was ESE, right? Not elementary?
That was ESC, and we're going to move to elementary unless we have questions.
I just have one quick question. Would it be appropriate for the ESE substitute that we're considering adding the permanent classroom substitute for the 10 plus self-contained units? We're adding that additional classroom sub. Would it be appropriate to put that on the ESE staffing plan and just say that for every school that has over 10 self-contained units, they would get an ESE classroom, permanent classroom substitute instead of putting it on the elementary staffing plan?
We certainly could. We had some discussion regarding that. The principal would actually hire the substitute, and so we wanted to keep that clear because if the ESE teachers are in place, that substitute wouldn't be needed, and so the school would actually utilize them in other classrooms. So that's why we kept it on the elementary side, but we can certainly move it over if needed.
Ms. Moran, I do have one question, and perhaps my question is about ESE specialists. So those are they not school-based, and so that's why they're not on this? I'm seeing heads nodding, so no, ESE specialists are not school-based, so that's why they're not on this list. Okay. All right, that answered that question.
I have a question, Chair. Thanks. Yes, as far as the ESE specialist, at some point we'll be seeing those numbers and staffing plan as well, right?
We can make that adjustment. On the district level, I'm sorry, it's on the district level, so that will come in April.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Moving to elementary, one of the changes, the drastic changes, as you will see, based on the 100-day count and the potential or the proposed allocations, you will see the dollars amount listed beside each item. So that is a big change. So if we want to make changes, we're able to do that with that amount there. We also added clarification that we already had that they could sub for instructional support for the counselor, but realizing and making it clear that that's only for an allocation greater than 1. So each school would have to have at least 1 counselor. But then if they are allocated additional units in this category, they can sub it out for instructional support the same way they can with the other areas. So are there any questions here? So we will move to middle school. I will say, and Dr. James alluded to it, we did add a second substitute, permanent substitute for 10 plus self-contained units.
Ms. Moran, on the elementary, since it's on the screen right here, with the ESOL paraprofessionals, it does show that there actually would be a reduction, and the predominant conversation that I had yesterday with multiple elementary school principals is that they don't want to lose what they already have. And so I understand that we're potentially considering reductions in some of these areas as well, but if that's to the detriment of what schools already have, I don't know that that's a direction we want to go in, that I want to go in, I should say. So that's just for clarification on that particular item.
May I?
Yes.
Can you explain what ELL population band is? So what does that mean?
So I will actually allow Ms. Hughes to share. She can articulate that much better than me.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So,
Morning, sorry, I was taking a drink.
that's fine. And looking at, before we even talk about the bands, first I want to be able to clarify the ruling for ESOL paraprofessionals and teachers that are ESOL endorsed. So in our consent decree, it states that English language learners shall have access to an individual proficient in their languages in addition to a trained ESOL subject area teacher. Schools with at least 15 students speaking the same home language shall provide at least one aide, which in our case will be an ESOL paraprofessional, or a teacher who is proficient in the same language and who is trained to assist in basic subject area instruction, so ESOL endorsed. So with that being said, and also as Ms. Morant shared, looking at several districts, what this initially says is 1 to 15 or more students in an L program are allotted one ESOL paraprofessional. So in our district, we have provided in excess several ESOL paraprofessionals to schools. It doesn't look that way throughout Florida. So with that being said, bands were created. So I believe you have a copy of the bands with you. They don't have it, okay. So with the bands that was created, we looked at, in keeping with this 1 to 17 ratio that was previously set, for elementary is 15 to 33 English language learners that would constitute one ESOL paraprofessional. 34 to 51 would constitute 2 ESOL professionals. 52 to 69 L students would constitute 3. 70 to 86 would constitute 4 ESOL paraprofessionals. 88 to 105 would constitute 5. 106 to 123 would constitute 6 ESOL paras. 124 to 141 would constitute 7. 142 to 159 would constitute 8. 160 to 177 would constitute 9. And 178 to 195 would constitute 10 in elementary. The high school bands, are we there yet? Not yet, okay. So that is for our elementary ESOL paraprofessionals.
Question. So the max that we have currently in our district is 10, based on the band?
Currently, we have 10 according to the band, but our highest populated school currently is College Park at 162.
Okay. So we're in compliance with everything.
We are beyond compliance.
Great.
So I have a question about this also. I understand that we're potentially looking at ourselves in comparison to the state of Florida and other districts around the state. Are we aware of what the other districts around the state with lesser ratios, what their actual academic data looks like on those students as well? Because I know that's what's driving part of this conversation for this specific population.
Not looking at the academic portion, because of course when we're talking about our English language learners, we are talking about language acquisition, and more so than looking at what is the outcome performance for students that's coming in with a limited English proficiency. What we're looking at is the ability for schools to make sure there's professional development and there's a culture inside of schools that's very inclusive in collaboration. We do recognize that teachers are certified in ESOL endorsed, which is one of the requirements, a work requirement here in Marion County. So we look at their programs and their ability to help students be able to understand the language and communicate the language. And so in looking across and looking at that aspect of an English language learner, looking at just state data when it is sent to us, we are making strides when it comes to access for L's and language proficiency.
Okay. Dr. James.
If I understand our English language learner program correctly, there are a variety of tiered levels of students who are defined as ELL. So some have more work to acquire the English language, and some have less work to acquire. Is that correct? There's like a tiered approach to their label. So some students come and they speak no English and carry a heavier label or a heavier weight, versus other students who've been in the program for many years and are potentially about to transition out.
They will not have labels, if you will. They all are considered English language learners, but within your access for L's or any type of screener that's given to them, they're given a score in each domain of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So with that being said, it's the way you instruct them based on how they scored, but there's not different levels within it. Of course, we do have our newcomers, and our newcomers are the ones that are here for the very first time. They may have had formal education and where they may have resided at, but they're coming into our system and they're in the U.S. for the very first time.
My question is, an ELL population at a school, if there's 30 kids, presumably they all have varying English proficiency. So, and that English proficiency is tied to that score that you just referenced, right?
Yes.
So, and to what Ms. Campbell's point is, we have some schools that potentially have students who have a higher need than other students. So to set a basic band which encompasses all students regardless of their need may be taking supports that are currently in place for a school like Sunrise or College Park. I don't know if I'm articulating that the right way, but I think that to have an all-encompassing band would not necessarily represent the specific needs at that school, because they may have a whole population of students who have very limited English.
That's not the reality for our schools, but I do understand your point. But I also want to highlight or bring to the point that an ESOL Para is not the one solution to being able to support that child. We also want our teachers and our CASs to make it a part of the culture in embedding ESOL strategies, having teachers participate in professional learning, and also utilizing our parents and collaborating with our parents to make sure that they're receiving the curriculum and instruction that's needed.
Okay,
Their support.
thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Thurr.
Oh,
Go ahead.
thank you, and thank you, Ms. Hughes. I have a question surrounding the screening process and the timeline. Are the ESOL specialists, are those district level folks?
We have 3 ESOL resource facilitators, and they are instructional personnel that support our students throughout the district.
Okay, and my question is that the process and the timeline and how kids are identified and how quickly they, in my mind, they need to be identified as soon as possible, of course, and I'm sure that's our goal. But what is that actual timeline, and what does that look like? And is there enough support there to make that happen?
Okay, thank you for that question. So in looking at eligibility for the ESOL program, it starts with registration with our IPCs at each school site. They will receive a registration. If there is a yes on the home language survey indicating that there's another language spoken in the home, or some various questions, there's 3 questions that appears there. If there is 1 yes, then we are required to screen that student according to the proper screener that is provided for our state of Florida. So kindergarten has 1 screener, and then 1 through 12 has a screener that we are required to give. Based on the results of the screener, then we will determine if the student is eligible for the program. So if they have a 4 or higher, and we determine that language is not a problem, they are not eligible for the ESOL program. But if it's lower than 4 and we see that there's a need for a language acquisition, then that student is put into our ESOL program. From the moment of the yes on the home language survey, there is 20 instructional days to assess the student at that point. So they are required to be tested. Usually they're tested by the ESOL paras or someone else in the school that's a designated administrator for any of our WIDA screeners.
Thank you for that. So this is relevant to the conversation in the sense that our ESOL paras are qualified to do those evaluations.
Our ESOL paraprofessionals are at our district, the ones that administer the assessment to our students. They receive training through the WIDA website online with Student Pathways and Assessment. They will provide access to that website and they will participate in a training there, and then they're able to test. However, we do have schools that do not have ESOL paras because they do not have 15 or more. At those schools, there is someone in each of those schools that are designated as test administrators for those students.
I see. Okay, thank you. And Dr. Gullett, this is something that I think you and I have spoken about previously, and it's part of our strategic plan. You know, we noticed the need, so now is definitely the time to share that need so that we can allocate our resources accordingly. Thank you. I appreciate that information.
I have an additional question just to make sure I wrote down all the numbers as you were saying them and in the banding. Is that a Marion County specific ratio, or is that something that the state uses as far as the 15 to 30? I'm looking at basically the first person takes the brunt of the work, and then once you have a 31st student, then all of a sudden that load gets lessened significantly. And if you get up to 51, then you're still going to have 5 less than the first person. I'm looking at a caseload scenario. So is that our ratio that we've created, or is that state?
The band is what we have created. The state says 1 to 15 or more. So in some districts, it's 1 to 100 or more.
And I understand that. I still would be interested in knowing which of those districts have the academic data to ensure that there's additional questions that I have about that. I understand we want to compare ourselves to others, but then sometimes we do when it's convenient. The other things that I wanted to mention was about, you mentioned that teachers and content area specialists. So I know in talking with elementary school principals yesterday, and this question may go to Ms. Morant more so than you, Ms. Hughes, but right now, the way our elementary staffing plan reads is that in the instructional support, schools with populations of 1 to 999 receive 1 of either a content area specialist, a testing facilitator, a magnet facilitator, or a student service manager. And that either is what's potentially bothering me, because especially if we're asking a content area specialist to support our English language learner students. I want to, like this, I'm writing down as you're talking. I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding. So maybe I'm mistaken there, that there are content area specialists whenever we have a higher ESOL population. Is that correct?
So a content area specialist, from my experience here in Marion County, they serve as academic resources or coaches to teachers. So they hold collaboration in schools, which I have been a part of at different schools. And I'm saying that during planning, that content area specialists, when they are in collaboration sessions and they're planning lessons, that they are going to adhere to bringing up the conversation of ESOL strategies and how are you reaching students in your class, and what type of strategies are you using? Pictures? Are you using graphic organizers? So that was what I was alluding to when I mentioned CAS.
Terrific. Well, and I appreciate that. I love that that's what their role potentially could be. But based on these staffing ratios and the way I'm looking at them, it may be that a school hasn't chosen a content area specialist from the district, and so we may not have that additional support. if I'm reading this correctly. And I'm seeing a head nod from our elementary principal that's in the room as well. But I received that from multiple principals yesterday as I was talking to them. I know I made a statement early on, and this is for Ms. Morant and the team. The main thing I heard from principals yesterday is they don't want to lose what they already have. And so some of what we're looking at on these staffing ratios is in fact going to remove some of the support that schools have right now and have been used to. And I don't like the idea of a school having to choose whether they're going to have a student services manager or a content area specialist. That's just a general topic. That's not necessarily for you, but because you did mention content area specialist, it gave me a wonderful window of opportunity there. Board, are there any additional questions about the ESOL at the elementary level?
Go ahead, Ms. James.
I was just going to offer almost all of our elementary schools purchase their CAS from their Title I budget. So they don't have it from the district staffing plan, but they are, I think every single elementary school has a content area specialist on their campus. There are a few schools, 8th Street and Madison Street, who have an instructional coach, not a CAS, so it's not under the instructional support column, but every other elementary school, being that they are Title I, has purchased one, at least, CAS.
And I understand that. Right now, all of our schools are Title I, but we also don't need to bank on that that's going to be the way that we strategize every year, because in fact, we may have a couple of those schools that are not Title I next year and don't have access to those dollars. Dr. N.H. Jones has just recently become Title I, because when my children were there, they weren't. So
Right.
that's why fundraising was such a big deal back then, because they didn't have additional resources and dollars, and I don't know that they always will. So that's my only concern. If the school support is being based on Title I funding, there's positive and negatives to that. Certainly we appreciate that funding stream and that funding resource, but there's a reason why you get Title I dollars, and so that.
But if N.H. Jones's is a supplement from the, N.H. Jones's CAS is a supplement from the district. That is in addition to the basic unit allocation.
And the basic unit allocation right now gives them the opportunity to either have a student service manager or a content area specialist.
Correct. So they have a dean, and then they have, the district has supplemented a CAS from the district pool of money. And Madison Street and 8th Street do not have enough Title I funds to purchase an instructional unit. So they can only purchase a para. So Dr. Curley has an instructional para that he's purchased with his Title I funds. And then the district, during COVID time, I believe, supplemented those two schools with an instructional support person, but they're not instructional support, they're in a classroom teacher instructional level unit.
Which is an ESSER-funded unit that goes away in a year.
Which goes back to the conversation that Dr. Gullett has had, that we have upwards of 300 positions that we'll have to figure out how to absorb into in some capacity if we're going to retain them.
Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hughes. You left real quickly. I had one more question for that. It's brief. I promise you it's real brief. I'm just asking for clarity. When you talked about the ESOL banding, you did say that in coming up with that band, those bands, that you did take in consideration the consent decree. Is that correct? Did I hear that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That was it.
Okay, Ms. Morant.
Thank you. Any other questions for elementary, or I know Ms. Sino is here representing elementary as well. So any questions for me or her prior to us moving forward?
In looking at these different areas, elementary, middle, high, how did we get input from the elementary principals, from the middle school principals, from the high school? How did that input come by?
Certainly. So we had a committee meeting, which included the three principals back in December. It was prior to our break. And then they came with a wish list and things that would be great that they wanted at the respective schools. And then with the list and the items that we discussed, they took it back to their respective cohorts, so the other elementary principals, the other middle school, other high school principals, and then we met again with that feedback after the break.
So for clarity, just for clarity for everybody that's listening, is there were cohort meetings prior to them as the delegates coming to talk?
Yeah, so in between the two meetings, so we met the first meeting, then they went back to the other principals during break and coming up out of break, and then we met again in January, and they brought back that feedback.
Thank you.
I guess while we're still in elementary, the one question that I asked of a dozen or more principals yesterday in elementary was specific to the one-to-one kindergarten paraprofessional. I called specifically the schools in my district, but also some that were potentially receiving 6 allocations or 4 new kindergarten paraprofessionals or even 3, because I wanted to know, and this again is, let me start with this. I would have started with this from the very beginning. As I told every principal yesterday, philosophically, I disagree with school staffing ratios. And what I'm about to say is exactly why. Because each one of those principals had different unique needs. A couple of them said, absolutely. If I had an opportunity to have 4 more people on my campus, they absolutely would be in kindergarten. However, with a couple of them, it almost became that a kindergarten para would be a seasonal position. Hear me out. This is totally something new that we've never even considered. But in talking to several of them, the kindergartners have so little knowledge when they first come. They don't know how to stand in line. They don't know how to button their pants. They don't know how to open their milk. All the things they don't know for the first 9 weeks and possibly even the first semester. But right now, they are rock star kindergartners, and they are rocking it. That's a seasonal position. And so if we dictate that they have to have a kindergarten paraprofessional, it might be that instructional unit would be better served to them to be a flex, as opposed to be just an outright kindergarten para. Even an ESOL para, an ESE para, like they when I asked specifically about if you had these 3 extra units, is that where you would put them? Because most of them, that's what they would be receiving, is extra para kindergartner paras. Most of them said, yes, but it would be much better if it was a flex position, or we'll take all the hands we can get. You know, I got lots of, it was like, we'll take, because, some smaller schools, they'll take all the help they can get because they're having to pull everybody to do car line and everybody doing this, that, and the other. So, philosophically, I disagree with staffing ratios in general because of that very thing, that schools and school leaders understand specifically what they need. I'm not really comfortable with the district dictating to them what we think they need. And that's where I feel on kindergarten paras. So I don't know if there's any feedback that there is about kindergarten paras additionally from what I received yesterday. But I right now am not comfortable with a 1-to-1 ratio on kindergarten paras, unless there was a way we could create a seasonal position. And we don't have that, and that's not possible. So that's where I land on that one. But I don't know what all of your thoughts are on that. Go ahead, Ms. Thurman.
Thank you. If COVID taught us anything, it's how to be fluid and flexible. And as the needs change, we have to be nimble enough to address them more or less in real time, because there's only 180 days in the school year. And I do hear what Chair Campbell is saying. Thankfully, kids make a lot of progress from the first day they arrive at school until Christmas time. And then there's also the reality factor. The reality factor is that even if you are a designated kindergarten para, especially over the past few years, you've been doing a lot of things besides just serving in kindergarten, not in addition to serving in kindergarten. I never want to say just, because these people are rock stars. So that's the importance of having conversations like this and coming back together to meet, because new ideas come out to address our current situation. We do our best to get the crystal ball out and try to predict what we may need in the future. But as it stands right now, we don't need to be losing anybody from our school sites. We have had tons of people working way outside their job descriptions for the past few years and doing it admirably. Kindergarten paras, we know the focus, we know the need. on early childhood education and intervention. We all know it's a lot less expensive to get it right the first time than to try to teach a 10th grader how to read. So I love where this conversation is going. I really like the idea of having as many flex positions as we can accommodate, because then people that are getting hired are being informed up front. While you may be getting hired to be a kindergarten para these early weeks, it is entirely possible that you will be pulled to cover a class. It is entirely possible that you will be helping with bus duty because teachers are out that day, and for safety, we need you to be able to do that. So there's a lot to this, and since Ms. Sino has come all this way, and I would really love to hear from her before she leaves about your current situation at your school and your feedback on the comments that you're hearing from the board so far. We're committed to doing all we can from our positions to getting this right and supporting through our superintendent your efforts, because you're where the rubber meets the road.
Good morning. Thank you. As far as kindergarten paras, so like Reverend Cummings said, how did we get input? After our first meeting, I emailed all the principals and I said, listen, this is the current, staffing ratio. I've been put on this committee. I need your feedback. The most feedback I got, and the most wish list, as we began to call it, was about kindergarten paras being back to one-on-one. Because of what we try to do as principals and school leaders and teachers is when students are struggling, we try to keep them in the classroom as much as we can. And when you're talking about kindergartners and possibly never being in school before, maybe because of the COVID pandemic, whatever it was, it's been increasingly more frequent that we get calls for kindergartners needing support with that in the classroom. So that was the most requests from principals that I received. Some were phone calls that I wrote down, and some they just gave me their input back in writing, but that's what I got.
Ms. Sino, may I ask, were the requests and the questions that you were asking of those principals, was that in the first 9 weeks or obviously in the first semester?
No, it was, when did we start? It was November, late November, early December.
So it would have been in the height of whenever they were experiencing potentially all of the challenges that I just discussed that potentially were seasonal?
Maybe, that's close to the middle of the year, so, yeah, first semester.
Sure. Okay. Did you have any feedback on guidance counselors? There would be 18 additional guidance counselors that we would be adding should we go with the plan that we currently have in front of us.
I received a little, and part of the input was from me that our guidance counselors are overwhelmed. I now have over 700 students with one guidance counselor. So I heard a few people request that we get an additional guidance counselor, especially to kind of align with middle and high school numbers and their units, so yes.
In conversation I had yesterday, some principals were saying, though, potentially if that extra guidance counselor could be a flex position because they actually needed a testing facilitator or something else as opposed to a guidance counselor to actually focus on the mental health needs of their students and then have someone else that served in another role. Do you think that would be something that would be beneficial, or? We're talking about flex right now a little bit because I don't like saying you absolutely have to have this specific person on your campus if in fact that's not the need of the school.
So you're asking if the second guidance counselor would also be flex? That would be amazing. I think a lot of principals would appreciate that because the APs are, inundated with testing, and even though the guidance counselors help with the access testing for ESOL and things like that, ultimately it's their responsibility. So that would be wonderful, and always as much support we could get in the mental health education.
Thank you. Dr. James.
Thank you for sharing your comments. I think that I have a question for Ms. Boston Ellis regarding kindergarten para funding. So kindergarten paras are funded out of referendum.
Don't go nowhere, please, because I got a question.
So kindergarten paras are funded out of referendum. I apologize for not being better versed in this. Is the referendum funding specifically for kindergarten paras, or is it for instructional paras?
Not for paras at all.
How are we funding kindergarten paras out of referendum?
I don't have, good morning. I don't have the specific language right in front of me, but it does talk about paraprofessionals. Doesn't say kindergarten paraprofessionals.
So, and we have, our job description is simply for instructional paraprofessional, not for kindergarten instructional paraprofessional. Is that accurate? Does
Can't
anyone?
speak to the job description, but
Okay.
if you look in the assignments, there's all kind of paras, kindergarten paras, Title I paras, ESOL paras, special needs paras. So there are a myriad of titles. Like I said, the referendum, that was a decision by the district at that time. The superintendent at that time decided that there needed to be more emphasis in kindergarten. And then at that particular time, we hired almost 200, I believe, kindergarten paras, because that was where she placed the emphasis. Not Dr. Gullett, but that was
Yes.
where that superintendent.
So, for instance, my daughter's kindergarten teacher was out on Friday. The kindergarten para, one of the two that supports her school, subbed in that teacher's classroom, but that para also spends time in that classroom. So that principal didn't have to find a substitute to cover the class. They were able to slide that individual who's familiar with the students right in. But outside of that, when all of the staff is present, that paraprofessional is able to pull a small group and able to run a learning center and all of those things. So I'm in 1,000 support for doing one-to-one kindergarten paras. I can appreciate Ms. Campbell's reflection on adding flex. So the reason I was asking those semantical questions is because is the job description a kindergarten paraprofessional, or is that just what we call it in Skyward or wherever? Because theoretically, if we added these additional kindergarten supports to our campuses, could they be added with as an instructional para that the principal could choose to put in kindergarten or could choose to put elsewhere on their campus to support the instructional needs? Are we able to still fund that through referendum? Because it is an instructional paraprofessional.
So are you asking my legal opinion on that?
Well, no, I'm asking
Throw the word legal in, throw me under the bus, right?
if they're all considered an instructional paraprofessional, it is okay to fund them through referendum.
That was the decision of the superintendent at that time.
Is that still an appropriate decision?
I can't speak to that.
Oh,
What I can
okay.
speak to is that the language of the referendum would allow for it.
Okay. My last question is, if we take $2 million of referendum money to add instructional paraprofessionals to our school sites, from a budgetary perspective, where is the other bucket that will come from? Is it school safety or special area teachers, or where? Because we're going to have to we're going to have to move the $2 million from one place to another, right?
Correct, and we would have to do some reshuffling. You're exactly right in terms of where units are funded, but I would also reflect that for next year's and the next 4 years referendum, we're supposed to be amping up safety. So we're looking at increasing our expenditures that are related to safety. So yes, we do that all the time, making adjustments. But again, if we're using those dollars, they're only for 4 years. And that was the concern 4 years ago. What happens to all of those 300 plus units that are currently being funded out of referendum? Not that we would do anything in terms of laying people off. I don't want that put out in the atmosphere, but that is a real concern, and it would be based on board direction. If your direction is to put those units in referendum, we will follow that, but we are all fiscally responsible in terms of what happens in 4 years.
Madam Chair.
Can I just ask one last question? This $5 million number then at the top, Ms. Morant, includes the cost, the $1.3 million cost of paraprofessionals being added from the general fund then, or from the referendum fund?
So this is overall, so the 2 million for our kindergarten paraprofessionals that's proposed,
Yes.
as of now, that would come out of referendum is what I'm hearing, but that overall number represents the total cost for all of the proposed positions that we have.
Okay, so in looking at that 5 million or 4 million number, whichever you want to look at, that includes the 2 million of kindergarten paras?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Bostonellis, for always helping us to stay fiscally responsible in that decision, because we do know that the referendum could go away in the next few years, and we have to be planning as if that's not going to happen, and have a plan of action in place. Ms. Sino, thank you for being patient and waiting, and thank all of y'all for coming out this morning and giving your input on this. Madam Chair brought up the issue about flexibility with these paraprofessional positions. And I'm asking this maybe because I don't know. It sounds like I'm hearing something. I just want clarity. So don't the principals currently have flexibility with how they utilize these paraprofessionals, whether they're kindergarten paraprofessionals or they're any other type of paraprofessionals? Don't they have some flexibility in that?
We have flexibility, so I have 3 IND units on my campus, and we have 6 ESE paraprofessionals that are, for the most part, in those rooms. But I have flexibility that if a pre-K ESE para is out, then I can send her into those rooms, an inclusion para, things like that. So we kind of keep them within their job description.
And with that flexibility and within their job descriptions, the paras are also under MESP, correct?
Yes, sir.
So we still have to work within the collective bargaining unit agreements in dealing with how we deal with the paras and how much flexibility the principals do have, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That is one reason why we recognize that paras were doing a lot of substituting and continue to do so, and added that, I think it's $50 a day supplement. There is an incredible amount of flexibility there. However, it's all in how it's communicated. You know, if you're hired feeling like and being told that you're going to be a kindergarten para, and then suddenly it's a good morning and now you're going somewhere else today, that's fine, because it's meeting the needs of the school. As long as that is known up front, you know, let's just put the cards on the table that this is where we are as a district, because we have a shortage, you know, of employees pretty much across the board. So that does need to be part of this conversation, because, you know, if I'm going to feel comfortable voting yes on things, I just want to make sure that the folks that are honestly doing the work are well prepared and understand, and that also includes training. You know, and I know that Dr. Gullett is committed to that. As a paraprofessional myself, that's how I got started. You know, I basically had to ask and advocate to learn. And so I'm glad to see that changing, because what I'm hearing is that these are really essential folks, and the funding referendum, we're very safe there as far as it just says paraprofessionals. It's not a designated class of paraprofessionals. And point well taken, because as far as the referendum is concerned, it is finite funding to meet what appears to be an infinite need. And we don't know what creative funding sources are going to come our way, you know, moving forward. But anything we can do to get these essential people under a consistent umbrella of funding that they can count on, you know, in this, if I was applying for a job, I'd really want to know that my job is going to be there 2 years from now, 4 years from now. We do a pretty good job of absorbing great people, you know, into our school community, no matter what happens with funding sources. But, you know, again, that's all part of this communication. Thank you, Ms. Sino.
Thank you, Ms. Sino.
Any other questions for elementary?
The last thing I'll say is just a comment, and it's not a question per se. I do I'm never going to say that our schools don't need additional support, but whenever I look at the ratios again, and I've already expressed philosophically how I disagree with this thought process, we do have one school that we're potentially adding 8 people to this next year. And that's fine if they actually need all of those 8 new people on their campus. Some of these schools will be receiving 4 new people on their campus, and those are just big numbers when we're looking at overall, if we're talking just strict on ratios. And if we're good with that, then I'm not sure where some of these folks are going to go. As far as I've talked to principals who will be receiving new individuals in administration, and they don't know where they're going to put that person because they don't have space. So there's some additional questions, I guess, that I have. But if we're going this route, board, I just want to make sure that we're understanding what it really looks like on a school campus to be adding upwards of 6 to 8 people to a campus that doesn't currently have those individuals on those campuses.
Respectfully, Madam Chair, even with the adding of that many people to a specific campus, is not the principal included in those decisions of getting that many people to come on if they needed that many? Can't the principal say, I don't need the 8, I need something else somewhere else?
And that's a great question, because if we give them a ratio that says this is how many people you're going to have, do they have the ability to turn it down?
Of course, I would think.
I mean, I'm asking that question because based on what I understood staffing ratios is that the district is actually telling you this is how many people you're getting. And so I guess they just reallocate their Title I dollars. Since we mentioned Title I a moment ago, I guess they reallocate their Title I dollars because then now they all of a sudden get all these people that they haven't had to pay for out of their own Title I money.
And that's a great question, and we've not had that asked, but just in my short time here, I don't think any principal would turn down
Right.
any staff.
Right, and so that's my point, that we're gonna all of a sudden dictate that you get 8 new people on your campus, congratulations. I'm not saying they don't need it. I mean, with a school with more than 1,000 elementary school kids, they probably need as much help as they can get. So I'm not gonna say that at all. But 8 people on a campus that they haven't had this year, with the same number of students potentially next year, that's just a large number. And so that's where I'm gonna philosophically disagree with staffing ratios, and it is what it is.
But I'm lost. I guess I'm lost.
Okay?
We just did something with staffing plans last year or so about the principals being able to say, hey, I may not need this, but I need that. So they were able to
Correct.
be flexible. Am I correct?
Correct.
So are we saying that if the staffing plan says they have to get 6 counselors, they have to take all 6?
No.
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 It was the flexibility that they still had.
That unit exchange process.
Correct. The exchange, okay,
It's
that's
an
what I was.
exchange process.
But also, there are many principals who are purchasing instructional paras from their Title I budget who very well would be able to afford another full instructional unit, teacher unit versus buying a para, because they would be able to free up their Title I funding because we would be adding paraprofessionals. And these paraprofessionals are going to live in the kindergarten classrooms or in another instructional classroom. They're not going to need an office. Like, the only people who would need an office are the guidance counselors.
Point made.
Madam Chair, if I may, I didn't want to interrupt, I wanted to allow Ms. Sino to go back to her building and thank her again for being here. And I know we still have a couple of other principals waiting here patiently, so I don't want to delay. But I do want to mention this. I've heard the board have conversation around funding. I heard referendum mentioned, and I just want to provide some caution to the board. I am uncomfortable with having a discussion about the referendum without all of the inclusive components of the referendum. So while I heard that would come out of referendum, I would caution to say may come out of referendum. I do not want to get ahead of that for the next discussion, because if we start making decisions now, it could have some adverse impact on other decisions that are made. There are a lot of moving pieces to that referendum, including safety, but also art and music and literacy and CTE. And so I just want to provide some caution to may. Doesn't mean it will. If the board makes a decision today and includes that $2 million, that may need to come out of general. It may need to come out of somewhere else. I just want to put that out there for decision-making purposes, because there will be an impact somewhere There always is, but it may or may not be out of referendum, and we may be making promises that we can't keep.
Thank you for
Thank you.
making that point, Superintendent, because that's vital. Because we keep talking about referendum as if it's this unlimited pot of money forever, and it's.
And we have an oversight committee in place for a purpose, and if I'm not mistaken, there have been things that the district at times have tried to allocate that oversight committee has overruled. Am I mistaken in that?
That is my understanding from the past, and we'll need to have a new oversight committee for this new referendum that's just been passed. So there's a lot of work left to be done with the renewal.
I don't think
Yes.
they overruled it. They didn't overrule it. They just may have, they don't have the ability to overrule it.
And that's why I asked that question, because I wanted to understand, is that 4 million number including the 2 million or not including the 2 million? Because that, whether we're funding it from general fund or referendum is the most important thing to clarify.
So I think to answer your question, I'm looking at the team, but this dollar amount was not budgeted for general dollars and is not currently budgeted for the referendum, and the renewal has not yet been decided what, if any, changes will be made. Because remember, this current referendum sunsets, and we have the renewal, and we have to look at what that looks like. There had already been a process of attrition based on the sunset of the current referendum, so we're in a very interesting time of transition, and we need to be really mindful of the decisions that are made for the next 4 years. But not budgeted, and not discussed yet for the new referendum dollars.
Correct, but this, I just want to make sure I'm clear. So this, without staff reductions on page 1 of the draft version 3, that says 5,338,502.91. That number includes putting the $2 million plus of paraprofessionals into the general fund.
No,
So it's
No.
two parts to your question. So yes, that $2 million is included in the 5.3 million here, but we have not identified where this 5.3 million will come from.
Correct, but that 2 million is included in that number.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right, because at this juncture, if my understanding is correctly, and then Vice Chair has something to ask, Ms. Boston Ellis, these are numbers based on what this would cost us. This does not at all tell us from where these dollars would come. This is additional dollars that we would be allocating for these specific needs that we've requested potentially in this draft 3 staffing plan that are over and above what
That
was in the
correct.
previous.
That was the direction of the board. What would this cost? You didn't indicate what funding.
How we're going to fund it, right.
Correct. You just wanted to know
Right.
what would this cost? And that's what we worked together to develop.
And while you're standing there, Ms. Boston Ellis, thank you so much. I know that this was so much work and so many hours, labor-intensive hours, but these 2 documents right here are documents I have wanted for 2 years. I'm so, so grateful to be able to see at my fingertips the numbers of positions funded out of referendum, the numbers of positions funded out of ESSER, all of it in one concrete doc. Thank you so, so much. I'm so grateful to you.
Well, you're welcome, but it's not just me. I have Thomas Dyke here with me. That is my staffing plan guru, and he helps a lot with the detail and knows a lot about the units. But what I would also add to that, it has budgeted and it has current as of February 1. And so those numbers have changed today in some way or form. And as we do budget amendments, the numbers will continue to change. So it's just at a point in time. And that's always kind of leery. We don't like to put out information like this. But as long as you understand that that's at a point in time and not, consistently. The budget is what you approved. And we bring amendments to you every month, and changes are occurring every month.
Vice Chair Thurber. Thank you, Ms. Boston Ellis.
Yes, thank you, and Ms. Boston Ellis is always reminding us of recurring costs. We are committed to supporting funding at the school level, along with our superintendent, committed to supporting professional development so that the folks that are in the trenches doing the work have what they need to get the job done. That comes at a tremendous cost apparently, because what we're asking for to get it all, I believe, is $5.3 million more than what's been originally proposed. So again, I appreciate this conversation to help guide my decisions.
Thank you. And prior to moving to, I want to move to middle school, but would you all like to hear from Mr. Johnson first or go through middle school? Just trying to be mindful of their time with us.
Madam Chair, can we go ahead and hear from Mr. Johnson? So that way,
Absolutely.
prior to that.
Come on up, Mr. Johnson. Good to see you again.
Northside Pride, come on.
Thank you for hosting such an amazing middle school basketball tournament this weekend. It was terrific.
Congratulations to Osceola, too.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Good morning. So do you have questions for me, or how's that going to work? You want me to
Tell us what your overall thoughts are on this here's what my question would be. When you were participating in a committee, you came to one document. And now what we have is something quite different.
Yes, ma'am.
So talk to us about where you started
Right.
and where we are today and your impression on both of those things.
Okay, so like Messino shared earlier, or whatever, when we came to the table with the first committee, we really came with a wish list. So it was kind of like, what do you want? And so we talked to some of our colleagues, and they were, we like testing coordinators at middle school. We want bookkeepers at middle school. We want, extra discipline support in middle school. So obviously, that's the good thing about having Ms. Boston Ellis there, is she's the voice of reason, and so she would tell us, okay, if we give you that, then where are we going to take it from? So I think through the process, and in going back and talking to our colleagues, Mr. Carlisle and I came to the realization that we just don't want to lose anything. So that was sort of our final recommendation, was just like, if we could just keep what we have, then that would suffice, especially because we do feel like we are stretched pretty thin, just like everyone else, and I think. Anyway, I just think that we came to the realization that we knew that we get the fact that it's a money game, and if we add something, we have to take something away. So we really just came to the conclusion that we would rather keep what we have.
Mr. Johnson, I know there's certain areas that are high priority.
Yes, sir.
Or high profile, and not wanting to lose anything, but there has to be some areas that you just can't afford to not get some people in. For one, that I know for you all is discipline.
Yes, sir.
With deans and APDs.
Right.
How is this going to affect that?
Well, I mean, I think I shared with some of you guys, I don't know how we would operate with less disciplined staff right now. I'm obviously, you guys know this is my first year at North Marion Middle School. We're working through some discipline issues and different things like that, just like every middle school. But I think it was Mr. Frazier sent out some data, a month or two ago, and it basically had every grade level in our district. And then the referral percentages for each one of those grade levels. And 6th, 7th, and 8th grade in our whole district is made up 48% of the referrals in our district. So if you think about that, I mean, there's those 3 grade levels, and it's, we all know, we've talked about it's a unique age. I think that's been the biggest revelation to me moving from elementary to middle school this year, is just how unique an age this is, and how that transition from elementary to middle school is a big deal. Things that they do now are not, so to speak, a slap on the wrist. They're a little bit serious. And I'll tell you, the one thing I think that, if you talk to any middle school or high school, or really probably even elementary discipline person, is the investigations that surround bullying. Because it's a constant thing. Anytime you talk to a parent about a discipline situation, it's like, but did you not know that my kid was being bullied? That's why they did that. And so then that opens up an investigation, which takes time, and it takes people away from being able to process referrals and do different things like that. And I think that that's the thing, that it's just there's just a lot that goes on down there, especially at the middle school level. So I just don't know how, I just wouldn't be in support, and especially being from elementary and just being fresh from elementary, I just don't necessarily agree with the fact that the support, especially in the discipline, is the same at all. I don't think it's, so when we're talking about ratios, I get that completely, but I think it's need, not numbers, would be what I would advocate for.
And I appreciate that, because I do understand that that 6th, 7th, 8th grade group of kids is totally different. Y'all are dealing with some stuff.
Right.
Y'all deal with those kids as, when I was growing up, the old folks say those are the kids that's starting to smell themselves.
Right.
And they smell themselves, so y'all dealing with some stuff. And I can't see us, if this plan is gonna pull that support away from the middle school, I can't support those. I have to support a plan that's going to make sure that you guys still have the support you need, because there are other kids that are not smelling themselves right now that are trying to get educated, and you're putting a lot of attention trying to keep the school stable. So we have whatever plan that we're going with, and I thank you, Ms. Morant, and all of you guys for putting this together, for trying to come up with the best plan. But I don't think there's a one plan that fits all that's going to work. We can't snatch the rug from up under you and expect you to do great work.
Well, and I think that's the thing. I think that, us at the little bit of the smaller middle schools don't want to necessarily, because again, I'm just being honest with you guys, and you guys see the data. We're pretty close to being in transformation ourselves. So again, I don't want to have to end up making the decision, do I want to value student safety and discipline over academics? You know what I mean? And that's what I feel like sometimes if we're going to have to choose between academic or instructional support and a dean. I think that, for safety and for the betterment of the school and the culture and everything, I gotta go with discipline right now. But does that not negatively impact my academics because maybe I don't have a CAS, or maybe I don't have someone else that helps support in that area? So.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and I agree, 100%. The last thing I would ever want to do as a school board member is pull resources that result in required processes like bullying packets being avoided due to lack of support and resources. We want to support discipline so that it becomes a culture of caring and compassion and academic focus and an environment that is conducive to learning. And it's going to take what it takes. And the data is clear. 48% of our discipline referrals here in this community comes from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So if we are not allocating our resources to those areas based on the data, then we're shooting ourselves in our own foot. So thank you for that.
Sure. Ms. Moran and I have chatted, and I want to offer us a solution, because one of the steps towards getting to site-based budgeting was to come up with district-wide ratios, because eventually when we get to site-based budgeting, there will be a set amount of money, and then we will have to supplement that from the district level to support a school. So in an effort to continue to try to do that, what I would offer is that we maintain the ratios that have been presented, and then in our additional allocations based on student needs, we add an assistant principal to Denellen, adding meaning maintaining. But if we were to go off the basic ratios that are presented, we would add those resources as additional allocations based on student needs to support the unique needs at those schools, with the understanding behind it that annually or every other year we are recertifying those needs, because needs do change and shift, so that we can acknowledge that the school population is producing this much money, which supports this much staff, but from the district level, we acknowledge that they need additional supports to be successful.
So from a funding perspective, Dr. James, you're proposing which of our options here?
I'm saying that we would move forward with the ratios presented for middle school specifically, and then when you look at our revised by school membership staffing plan and you see the negatives for middle schools, those negatives would become maintained, but they would be put onto an additional allocation request, essentially saying, Mr. Johnson, it's not necessary to do the actual paperwork, but Mr. Johnson would submit an additional unit allocation request form for an additional AP at his school for next school year, using discipline data to support that that's a necessity. And then we maintain that allocation as long as that need is there, and that may be forever, or that may not be. But as we get to site-based budgeting, we're going to have to eventually have the conversation that he's not generating enough funds to fund 2 APs and a principal theoretically. And so the district would have to supplement a smaller middle school like this to ensure that they have the supports they need.
Chair.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, and I like the thought process. That leads me to a question, and maybe one more for Ms. Moran, or maybe you've experienced it yourself already, Mr. Johnson. The idea of the unit allocation request, I really like that because it implies that there is flexibility, it implies that there is trust, it implies that there is really hearing, again, from the trenches, what the needs are. And it says in this version that I'm looking at, blue, and on all the other versions in another color, units may be added or removed based on student needs, program changes, and/or enrollment changes. And my question around that is, I'm wondering how many site-based leaders have asked for these units and that they feel they need, and how long does that process take? Because while it may look good on paper, again, there's only 180 days in the school year. They need what they need, and we have a principal standing up here in front of us right now saying that what he needs, and it doesn't include losing anything.
Madam Chair, if I may, I think Ms. Morant could probably answer that question, but I don't know if you want to do that now or let Mr. Johnson answer any other questions so he can get back to
And
building.
it's 10:16, so we will be having a moment of silence in just a moment. So if you'll bear with me for just a moment. So on February 14th, 2018, 17 innocent lives were taken when a murderer opened fire at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Students, teachers, and faculty showed great courage in the face of danger. The sacrifices of these heroes, as well as the brave action of first responders, will never be forgotten. In memory of the lives lost in this tragedy, Governor Ron DeSantis hereby directs that flags were flown at half-staff today on all government buildings and installations and grounds throughout the state from sunrise to sunset, and also that all residents of the state of Florida will pause for a moment of silence at 10:17 a.m. in honor and memory of those at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. It's 10:17 a.m. Please pause for a moment of silence. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Morant, I believe we were at a question specific for you, I think. That's where we were. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you ask the question?
I know.
I apologize.
It is what it is.
Ms. Morant, I think so Vice Chair Thrower was asking about the process and how many have requested that and received those exchanges allocations based on requests from principals. I don't know that Mr. Johnson has all that information. It would have put him on the spot for that. Certainly, I think that HR has that
Can
information.
we hear it from Mr. Johnson?
But go ahead.
Madam Superintendent, because I'm concerned with that process as well. And the reason I ask that, because I don't ever want a principal to feel like they're out there trying to stay above water, and we have a process that's in place that's hindering them from being successful. So I kind of want to hear from the principal.
I don't have personal experience with that process because I've always at a very small school, so we typically I don't have extra positions typically. However, I haven't heard anything about it being a negative process. The one thing I think like to speak to a little bit was what we talked about in the elementary conversation. Mr. Carlisle and I mentioned this, and it's just. And it might be, and maybe it's semantics or whatever. Like, and Ms. James or Dr. James alluded to this as well. We would probably, me anyway, would like a little bit more flexibility, maybe with some of these naming of these positions. Maybe we call them instructional support, but as long as, like you guys said, we're up front with everyone. Everybody knows what they're getting into. There's no surprises. I think there's some stuff with the MESP that we would have to navigate navigate. But I do think that because I mean, like I think back to my elementary time, and like you say, you talk about the kindergarten pairs being seasonal. I would love to maybe start them in kindergarten and get those kids acclimated and do all the stuff that we talked about, and then maybe move them to third, fourth, and fifth grade to push in small group, things like that. I think that that's a more strategic use of your person than to just, like you say, leave them in kindergarten because they are tied. And I do believe there was a time, if I remember correctly, like maybe in the previous administration where they were tied. Because that's what we would always get, we had, like, when I was at Anthony, for instance, I might have, I had a lot of ESE special needs pairs, but they were tied to specific classrooms. I had kindergarten pairs, but they were tied to specific classrooms. So I had very few that I had the flexibility to be able to put with MTSS or do different things like that. So I think that with that, maybe giving principals a little bit more autonomy with some of those positions, and I don't know how that all works exactly, but I think that would be a benefit to anybody, just because then you could really use people where they're needed. But that's what I would speak to as far as that goes. But as far as the actual process, I think at the end of the day, us as principals, like I'm sitting here thinking, like, I don't care how they end up on my, like, whatever you want to say, if you want to add them extra, if you want to do whatever, like, I get it. But I'm one of those people that my data is going to support me having an APD, and it's going to support me having the extra dean or whatever right now. But I do think about some of my colleagues that maybe the data is not off the charts like ours is. But it still has that need. So I think that's where I do think that it is beneficial that they have the ability to be able to do that.
And Madam Chair, and I asked that question, and I thank Vice Chair Thor for going that way about this process, because I do know of principals that have some higher needs in certain areas, and when they've got to that point where they've tried to request it, it's almost like there's a wall, because the ratios doesn't justify them, but there's a need there. And when I look at this, and it says based on student needs, program changes, or enrollment changes, I feel like this: if the principal's coming saying there's a need, it's not just his need or her need, it's a student need, and we need to take that into consideration and not have that red tape or that bureaucracy they're trying to hinder it. If we can afford it and it can be done in such a way that we're fiscally responsible, that school needs that support. That's giving the school the support that needs to be successful. If they're saying I need a dean or whatever it is, something in discipline or whatever it is, and we're saying, no, you can't have them, and then we expect them to do the same amount of work, plus, it doesn't work. That doesn't work for me. That doesn't work for that school. That makes people say, I can't handle this job. I'm quitting. I'm walking away from the field. And we've had a lot of folk do that because of being supported. So.
Well, and I think that would be the fear too, is like if you take it from the staffing plan and we rely on having it added because of a need every year, then you do, as the principal, I go up against but if I do ask, they do have the potential to tell me no. You know what I mean? And it's not that it's automatic because I have a need.
Right.
Then they could still tell you no. So then it's a little bit more. You feel a little bit more comfortable with it written in there, obviously.
Thanks, Mr. Johnson.
Madam Chair, if I may comment on the exchange and opportunity for request. If it is the board's intention for it to be a yes, then it shouldn't be part of the exchange. The definition of need is broad. And if it's an expectation that it's an automatic yes, then that process is not intended to do that. I'm not on that committee. I let the team do that. But I have walked a school with a principal in recent months and said, I said, tell me about this. And they said, yeah, it was denied. And I said, okay, well, let me see what I can find out, just because it's something I personally observed as an instructional leader. But it's not an automatic yes. So to this discussion, I think that's important for the board to recognize.
Vice Chair?
Yes, thank you for that, because I almost feel like that a statement might be more clear that units may be added or removed based on unanticipated student needs. We're trying to anticipate here. We're trying to be proactive. We're trying to hear you and put things in place that you know that you need. And, if 20 kids from the Ukraine come to Anthony Elementary School all of a sudden for families, that's definitely going to be an unanticipated need that we just couldn't foresee. So that's my statement on that.
And thank you, Dr. Gullett, for that as well. I think we all have heard stories of requests that had been denied for one reason or another. I mean, I think that that's potentially part of the reason that conversation was occurring. It causes challenges whenever we are talking about being fiscally responsible and saying yes to every need. And that's our challenge right now. I have concerns about these numbers. And I'm speaking specifically to the $5.3 million that we're looking at that would be in addition to what we were looking at for a staffing plan. This board member is not comfortable with reducing any staff at the middle school level. The one thing that I heard from every middle school principal I spoke with, and it was at least half of them, was that they need additional support for testing facilitators and teacher observations. And so if we're taking away specifically from 3 middle schools as indicated on this, who's going to do some of that work that's so valuable and they're already spread so thin? So I am not comfortable with taking away either specifically here. I would potentially be comfortable if we are sticking with ratios, and it seems as if we are, for the bookkeeper position to actually be at 1,500 students instead of 1,300 students. That would have us only adding 1 bookkeeper, but having conversation with both of the principals that this would impact, it seemed as if one principal that needed it the most was at 1,500 students as opposed to 1,300. So that one change I would recommend. But beyond that, that's what I see on the middle school staffing. Board, do you have any additional questions of Mr. Johnson? Would love for him to be able to get back to his school. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Madam Chair, may I also thank you, Mr. Johnson, for being here. We appreciate you. So to the whole conversation again about staffing and the additional units, the other concern I would have from a fiscal perspective would be it's not as apparent how much we're spending on positions. So Ms. Morant, I really don't want to put you on the spot, or Ms. Bostonellis, do you happen to have the cost of the additional allocations we provided to schools because of that exchange and the request based on need? Would you have any idea how much that is? No, but we can get that to the board. Again, you don't see that up front because it's not part of this, but I know that there are a number of positions that have been allocated, so.
I think that would be some good information to have where there have been additional requests and to know how much that has costed us in the past.
Ms. Brandt, do you have any idea how many positions have been allocated that are outside of that ratio based on that process?
Thank you. There's a sheet, so Mark totaled it for me. It's 31 right now.
31 positions have been allocated that are not on the staffing plan ratio.
Thank you. Can y'all send that to us?
And that can, you should have it. What I'll need to do is update and get you the costs associated with that.
Thank you.
And some of those are through unit exchange, and some of those are through just an additional unit request. So there are 2 ways that schools are able to request that.
And who makes the final determination when there's a unit request?
So there's a
Whether it's
joint,
denied or approved?
oh, I'm sorry, there's a joint committee made up of our 3 chiefs. So our chief academic officer, chief financial officer, and chief operations officer, and I'm there as well. So that decision is a collective conversation based on the information that's provided from the school and the area superintendent supporting the request.
So the school, I'm just talking about, I guess the principal requested from their area superintendent.
Yes,
And that superintendent brings it to the chiefs.
correct.
And how fast is that process?
It depends, and just to be as transparent as possible, there's been a request that took a month, and there's been a request that we've turned around in a week, and there are different things that makes that up. So
Right.
there was one request where they asked, the school asked for an additional dean based on need, but we needed data to support that need. So once they sent that need, and then it was scheduling, so getting the 4 of us on the same day, we shoot for Mondays.
Gotcha.
But the longest I think it's probably been about a month.
Thank you.
Yes, so we do have the numbers of individuals, we just don't have the
Yes,
individual
and I can
costs.
send that at a later time.
Right. And it does look like, well, not all, but some of these additional allocations are specific to transformation schools. Not all, but some of them.
Any other questions or thoughts on middle school? And I'm assuming, and I don't know if we need to pause each page, are we going to go over everything, then come back and determine what the consensus is of the group, or do we want to do that at each section? And I'm just thinking mainly because we have Mr. Carlisle here.
I think we should go on to high school now
Okay,
and have
perfect.
Mr. Carlisle come
Thank you.
help us so we can get him back to Vanguard. Thank you for waiting so patiently. We appreciate you, Mr. Carlisle. Thank you for taking my call yesterday. One of the many.
Good morning. Just about the process, it was a pleasure to serve on the committee. It's my second year doing it, and I enjoy the work of the committee. I'm honored to represent my peers. After the first meeting, I did go back, solicit feedback from my peers, had conversations with a few of them. As Mr. Johnson said, we bring our ideas, and it's kind of blue sky, but we also understand there's a cost factor to everything that we ask for. Ultimately, for the high school level, we did not feel that we could, substitute anything for any of the things that we really wanted. So in the interest of not losing anything, we decided to kind of keep what we've had the last year. Our biggest priority for me, the high school level, I think, was to account for our larger schools, so Westport and Forest, making sure that they have adequate staff to support the significantly larger population that they have. And I see in the staffing plan that's been considered, and I know that Westport gets several additional staff members, so that's important because with 2,900 students, they certainly need it.
Thank you, Mr. Carlisle. I know I had conversation with you and several principals yesterday specific to the ESOL paraprofessionals because that was something that was left out of the original staffing plan conversation. Would you mind speaking to that for just a moment?
Yes, absolutely. We have seen a pretty decent influx of ESOL students come in to our school. I know my school specifically, but I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say we have quite a few new ESOL students that arrive. I think I'd be allocated 2 additional ESOL pairs. I would absolutely use them. Right now I have one. She's amazing, but she is stretched thin. I can speak. We've seen, I have a Ukrainian refugee. She doesn't speak any English, and their alphabet, I think, is different than ours. So that alone takes a tremendous amount of time. We've seen quite a few students coming in from Venezuela, Cuba, Puerto Rico, obviously, but we do have a higher population than we have had, at least when I got to Vanguard 5 years ago. So it would be helpful.
Thank you. Board, any additional questions of Mr. Carlisle? Vice Chair?
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Carlisle. It's always a pleasure to represent Vanguard High School, and I appreciate, our ongoing professional dialogue. It means the world to me that you are straightforward to say, hey, we're rolling along pretty well. Here's some areas that we could use more support. And again, it's that type of trusting support that is going to move our needle at an accelerated rate. So I'm grateful to you for that.
Appreciate you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Carlisle.
Anything else for
Or-
Mr. Carlisle? Go ahead. Sorry,
Thank
I didn't know you paused. I thought you were finished. You just said thank you to Mr.
He was
Carlisle.
just taking a breath.
No, thank you for the input that you've given into this process and for the high school part of this. I think Vanguard being one of the schools that is kind of like in the middle, the top, as far as population and stuff, it's a good school to kind of use to gauge the district. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's it, Mr. Carlisle. Thank you so much.
Thank
We
you all.
appreciate
Have a good
you and for being a part of this process.
Wonderful. So with high school, in comparison to our last version, the only thing we were adding is the ESOL paraprofessional, and again, based on that ELL population band that Ms. Hughes spoke about earlier.
Board, my only question, and all the principals I spoke with yesterday specific to ESOL paraprofessionals were grateful, similar to what Mr. Carlisle has just stated to us, that is a significant need that I can't see us not putting emphasis there. At least that's my perspective. From the assistant principals and the addition of 2 assistant principals on 2 of our campuses, and speaking with both of those principals about that yesterday, I'm not certain if there's a way we can adjust the ratios or what have you. I'm not certain that that's where, if they were to gain 2 new positions, that they potentially would take 1 assistant principal but may put that other person into something else. And so as long as we're okay with understanding that they may adjust their unit based on student need and that they might not utilize a second, or actually would be what, a 6th AP.
I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm just trying to, if they're not going to potentially utilize a 6th assistant principal, and they might be able to use that extra allocation somewhere else, then if we're okay with that, obviously that changes the cost on what that might be. And so that's where the trading of individuals, I know I asked that one time, where we talked about that very briefly at one time, but it's not dollar for dollar, it's person for person. And so certainly, and I know principals do this, and we've talked about that they're going to use their Title I dollars for the things that, they may put 2 people using Title I versus putting the expensive person off on the district. And so I understand that happens, but still, that money comes from somewhere. And so we're going to have to figure out what that looks like. So, Dr. Gullett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may, I think this is an important time to have Ms. Morant speak to, if there's an exchange, we have to be mindful as the employer of personnel changes. If there's a change in leadership at the school, another instructional leader may come in and have a very different opinion of what they want to do with personnel. We have to be mindful of that as the district. So, Ms. Morant, can you speak to if that exchange is made, what the guarantee is or what the obligation is and what that looks like?
Sure, and I will say, as far as exchanges that I've been a part of, that has been probably the scenario for the majority of the requests, where the prior principal had a need and they requested something, and now the new principal, that's not the need they have, and they exchanged it. So we had this conversation in the unit control meeting, what that looks like. What do we want to solidify as far as that process? And one of the things, so we don't have people every year coming in, switching up. We want them to be committed to that at least for an additional year. So you request it this year, but you also have that the next year. And so one reason it addresses that personnel issue, and it also puts some deeper thought back into our principals, so they're able to think through and ensure that this is something, I don't want to say that they'll be stuck with, but a decision that they're not making lightly because they know they have this process. Let me come and switch everything up. Okay, next year I don't like that, let me switch it up. But it really puts a lot back on that principal, and it does assist with budgeting as well, and be able to know that, okay, this position, they won't be exchanging this position at least for another year. And I did want to, when I was being rude and jumping in, I wanted to point out, when we were discussing at the last work session, we did indicate that the APs would be a position or a category that we are able to exchange out after the initial for an instructional support staff. So I can ensure that that's notated if that's still the direction or desire of the board.
I mean, I think giving the principal the autonomy to know where that is great, where their greatest needs are, they know their schools better than we do. And again, I loved what Mr. Johnson said, need, not numbers. I wrote that down because that you couldn't explain what I've been saying more than just that, those three little words, need, not numbers. Because everything we're doing here today is based on numbers, and that's philosophically not where I think we need to be driving this bus. But as long as we absolutely understand that an assistant principal and that unit allocation can be exchanged for something based on the needs of the school. Vice Chair?
Thanks. And yes, numbers are dollars, and need drives placement. You know, what are the needs of each and every one of our schools? And also being mindful that, you know, with new principals that we have, just like in our teaching cadre, we have some very seasoned teachers, and we have some very seasoned principals and some new principals. And it would make sense to me that the new principals probably need and want and should expect, you know, support and guidance as they make their decisions, and a lot of encouragement. Some of my guiding lights are, as I think through this, is that it does take 3 to 5 years to create any culture change. And so my prayer is that the great principals that we have will stay, that they'll be that they feel well placed, you know, at their schools, and they're already actively excited for next year because we have to do so much planning in advance. And I think it's also super important to always emphasize that, yes, you know, we have a very large budget. We also have very large needs. And all of that money, it doesn't come from Title I, it doesn't come from these categories, it comes from the people. It comes from the taxpayers. And with that in mind, we have to make sure that everything that we're doing is focused on return on investment. And our investment, of course, is our kids and our people and everything that we do here. So I continue to be really appreciative of staff's time, the superintendent's time. None of us are satisfied at where we are as a district. You know, if we were, there would be no need for deep conversation. You know, we would just go along to get along and keep the status quo. But that's just not, you know, the game here, or any game any of us are interested in playing. So I do want to reiterate, and I know you've heard it from other board members already today, that we are, you know, in this to win it, right along with the rest of you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So where does that put us?
In need of $5.3 million.
I know. Board, would we like to take a 10-minute break?
Yes.
We've been going for an hour and 45 minutes or so. It's 10:42. Let's take a 10-minute recess, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming back out of recess at 10:53 a.m. So, I think the last statement question I asked was, where does this leave us? Board, perhaps if we work in reverse, since we just heard from high school, if that would be okay with you all, let's work in reverse and see what we want to do, if we want to make all of these recommended changes here, and we see the costs associated with each.
Chair Campbell, may I interrupt before you start
Please.
discussion? In speaking with Mr. McGowan during the break, he shared some concern with the school counselor and the note that has been added that they may sub for instructional support for allocations greater than 4 in high school or greater than, particularly the ones in middle and elementary, and just what that may pose based on the workload of the counselors if a principal does decide to switch out the counselor for a CAS or testing facilitator or anything else. I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and we can wait until we get to middle or elementary, but I just wanted you to hear from him concerning that.
Thank you for that, Ms. Morant. And honestly, I also had a principal that had reached out specific about all the elementary school guidance counselors that we potentially will be adding, and I'm not saying that we don't need them. Their concern is, from where do those guidance counselors come? And most often they're from instructional support. And so we may be pulling from classrooms to fill a guidance counselor position because we now have it on a staffing plan, and then that actually reduces the classroom support, which is where we really need it the most.
That was concern shared with the team as well.
So because guidance counselors aren't specific on the high school, perhaps we can go ahead and discuss high school and get high school. But thank you for that, Mr. McGowan. That definitely is a point that we need to stress. So board, where are we with high school? And first of all, let's take each one of these sections. So from the assistant principal perspective, looking at what was originally proposed versus what is currently proposed, we are looking at adding 5 assistant principals based on ratios. And I'm going to question the ratios, frankly. I'm wondering if we, if our numbers shifted at the 2,500 mark instead of the 2,250 mark. I'm not sure. I'm open to your suggestions, board, but the principals I spoke with didn't necessarily indicate that those were requests that they had specifically. And even possibly the school with 1 AP position would potentially adjust that for something else. But the other 2 that were receiving 2, possibly at 2,800 students, you might need to have 6 APs. I can, and how many do they have right now? They have 4? Or?
So, yes, so right now on the high school level, each school has at least 3, an APC, an API, and an APD. And this is based on ratios, not additional units they may be assigned. And then for enrollment of 2,700 or more, they're allocated a 4th position, and that's an API.
And Ms. Morant, pardon me, I stepped out for a second briefly, and I think it was right in the middle of the conversation of how long it typically takes when data is provided for another unit allocation.
So it's the ones I participated in, they've ranged from 1 week to 1 month. And some of the things are, the considerations that go into that is if we need additional information, and then also scheduling a meeting with the unit control team. But our goal, we really strive to have a meeting every Monday when there's a need. But sometimes just based on the schedules, it's hard, and then also getting additional information from the schools.
I see, okay. And it sounds to me possibly like some defined procedures around that request may take care of that lag time, because I really like the concept, I really do, because that's real time and to be responsive. I just think it's a great guideline, and I think that with some procedures around it and making it really clear where you find the form, just in the hecticness of the day-to-day, I can see how it could feel like one more thing to do, even though you know you need it. So,
And I will say, even with the form, we try not to allow that to hinder. So even if they submit the information via email, we take it to unit control, we can have them fill out, and we have had them complete the form on the back end and then gather signatures.
I see, and I would like to hope that it's the data that's the most important piece.
Yes,
It's like, if you're going to come with a request, even though it's been a desperate day, please share your data, and let's make sure that that data is really easily available and can just transmit it out there and make the process.
And the area soups, they do assist a lot with that process and gathering that information for submission to us.
Great, okay, thank you.
So board, I'm interested in a little bit different ratio, and I'm not sure if you are on assistant principal, but entertain this thought process that I'm having. If we have 3, I'm looking at the original staffing plan that we started with, that there were 3 assistant principals for high school. And then we potentially could add a 4th at 2,000 students and a 5th at 2,500 students. That would still ensure that Westport, which is our largest school, would be receiving 1 more AP than they currently have. And it would also ensure that Forest was receiving 1 more than they currently have.
And then that would take care of not taking away, because that's my biggest concern. I don't know how we can't be responsive to that when we have had, great principals standing before us this morning sharing that they need what they need. And then others that would be getting more saying, I don't feel comfortable getting more if that means my colleagues that have demonstrated a need will be getting less. I just can't support that.
So we didn't, in the ratio that we received on this little spreadsheet, show that any schools would be losing. So I think that if we went back to the original look here, that everybody would have 1 APC, API, APD, and then we would have an additional AP added at 2,000 students, and then still a 5th AP added at 2,500 students. That changes the ratios. I mean, we had original, in the draft version 3, it has us at 1 to 849 and then 850 to 1199 and all of that. But I haven't worked in a high school, but this is an assumption on my part, so I welcome the feedback from someone who wants to clarify. But I would be of the mindset that an APC, an API, and an APD are needed on all high school campuses. And maybe that's just an assumption on my part, but I think that's going to be regardless of if you have 1,000 students or if you have 2,900 students, that those 3 positions are probably needed.
Looking at that, when do they get, maybe I'm reading this wrong, when do they get the 3rd?
Well, what the draft 3 says, they get the 3rd when they reach 1,200 students.
No. That's
No.
not what it says.
Okay, I know, it's very confusing. 2,
Goes from 2 to 4. So it's
So it should be, they would get 1 one APC for enrollments of 1 to 849.
right.
For enrollment of 850 to 1199, they would, in addition to the APC, they would get an API or APD. And then the same thing, they would get that 3rd allocated unit for enrollment of 1,200 to 1,699.
Okay, I just see the line drawn through the 1 through 3.
and we
Oh,
have,
that's an error, thank you.
yeah, and we have 1 school that's barely over that 1,200 mark. So I'm very concerned about dictating ratios on high school assistant principals, because if for any reason that school falls below 1,200 and hits 11,997, I'm not pulling, this board member is not saying that they don't need one of these AP positions. That's why, I know we went to ratios, and I know that's what this whole dialogue has been about ever since the first day we talked about school staffing plans. But this board member feels that an APC, an API, and an APD is needed on every high school campus, and then we add based on numbers after that. And the number that I'm comfortable with is they get one more at 2,000 students and two more at 2,500 students, or an additional at 2,500 students. So that does shift, that's an addition of 3 instead of 5 on this plan. Board, I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
So is this saying that a school that doesn't have 850 students,
But it doesn't.
high school,
But it doesn't.
Which doesn't
That
exist,
doesn't
yeah.
exist.
Right.
right?
The only thing that comes close to existing is North Marion High School with 1,270 students enrolled.
So all of our schools are over 1,200,
Correct. So we've
1,200 plus.
created ratios to drive what we already have in place. So what I want to ensure that if we are putting in a staffing plan, ratios, and that dictates staffing, if in fact, for whatever reason, North Marion High School fell at that 1,197 number, that they all of a sudden would only have 2 APs, and I'm not comfortable with that.
Well, just let that be the base,
The base.
The base would be the 3 APs, which is where we started. Right, which is exactly what I was saying. So if we went back to the original plan,
Version 1.
version 1 for AP high school specific, that's all we're talking about right now. We went back to version 1, but where it said API at 2,700 plus, we would just say an additional AP at 2,000 and then another AP at 2,500. So that would give Westport High School 2 extra assistant principals next year and would give Forest High School 1 extra.
No, Westport already has 4, so they would get 1 additional next year.
Okay, then they would get 1 additional. I'm sorry. Correct.
Well, base. They would get 1 additional base, and then it gets to the unit request.
Right, so the maximum number on this would be 5 assistant principals instead of 6.
Instead of 6. Without taking away from current needs.
Correct. It wouldn't adjust everybody would already have what they currently have, but Forest would be receiving an extra and Westport would be receiving an extra.
Which, considering they're both the size of small townships, they
Correct.
need the support. The question is, how much more support can we afford? And then if they request it and I don't even want to say justify, they provide the data, then we need to be responsive and put that to work.
Dr. Gullett, do you have thoughts on that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the ratios, it is my recollection that the reason that these ratios are here is because the board wanted ratios consistent across levels in a prior conversation. So I just want to be clear about that, because that's why the team came back with the ratios, because that was the request of the team. And I'm now hearing again about the exchange. I just want to be clear so that no one is later disappointed or concerned that the process didn't work as planned. So if it is the intention of the board to have a position in there, I wouldn't say let's rely back on the exchange. There's a process in place. And while I think it's not perfect, I think it's a process in place that continues to be tweaked and adjusted. Our commitment is helping and supporting schools. But I don't want there to be a concern from anyone that something was not approved and later it said you had this process and you didn't approve it, because it's a process, it's a procedure, it's not a guarantee. So I just don't want there to be concern later that we were not transparent about that. Thank you.
And the unit process is new. The unit request process is new. And keeping in mind how difficult it's been to communicate out because of the whole COVID thing and half of our staff being out half the time, it makes it pretty difficult to make things clear. And sure, on paper, I'm fine with having the bigger schools have more. That is one aspect of measurement that doesn't not make sense going by numbers. But then we also just had a big conversation and heard directly from principals that while their numbers may not reflect that need, that the needs are certainly there. So it's all part of the bigger picture, and trying to find a compromise where the bigger schools are getting more support without taking away from schools that may not on paper be so large in their numbers, but definitely have the needs. So I feel like what I'm hearing is providing another step towards greater support while still supporting what we already know is needed. And, you know, for $5.3 million, we could just say yes and this would be over. We could all go to lunch and, but there's more to it. You know, we haven't even had conversation yet about, you know, district staffing plan and how, as Dr. Gullett shared, very important that the referendum, how that money is going to be allocated. You know, we continue to be stuck with having a lot of need and evidently finite resources. So as a bit of a compromise, while still acknowledging the current situation, I think that the chair's proposal has merit.
Works for me.
Okay, so Reverend Cummings?
I'm good.
Okay, so while it is still an increase from from the starting point, it's not as much of an increase as was proposed in draft 3. Okay? Other items in high school. We heard specifically about the school counselor line that mentions about substituting for instructional support. Is there a way that we can remove that line as an option that specifically for school counselors that school leaders would not have the ability to choose? Is that what I think the question is?
Do you want to speak?
I think. Mr. McGowan, do you
That
mind
is, I'm
speaking
not
to
sure
that?
if you want to speak as to why, but that is the request.
Okay. Because first of all, I'll ask 2 questions of you, Mr. McGowan, as you're walking. Are you comfortable with the ratios specifically for high school that we now have indicated on the new draft? And then secondarily, is it the request that we would remove that line that's currently in blue?
Yes, I am comfortable with the current ratios at all 3 levels. I think that, and I want to start by saying I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the recognition of the need of our school counselors. This would, by my count, add approximately 20 units, K-12 of school counselors, which I definitely think is needed. It would lower our overall district counselor to student ratio by more than 100, which is significant. My concern with how it's written for the school to be able to have the ability to turn that into another instructional unit is not a concern now. With the additional units, we would, like I just mentioned, we would see a significant improvement in our ratios. But moving down the road, I'll just take Fort King Middle as an example. They have approximately 1,500 students. They have 3 school counselors. Let's say 2 or 3 years from now, 2 of those 3 counselors decide to transfer to another school, retire, or whatever it may be. The principal now has to hire those 2 counselor units. To your point, we do have a struggle with hiring school counselors. It is one of the only job classifications, one of the few that I am aware of that is an instructional unit that requires by the state a master's degree. It is extremely hard to recruit school counselors unless they have the passion for it, and that's what we rely on. So if a principal runs into any delay or hardship in hiring a school counselor, it would be very easy for them to say, okay, well, I can't find anyone, I'm going to turn this into a CAS position, or whatever the case. And I sympathize with that. I've worked at a school, it's all hands on deck. So any support, so I get their mindset with needing that additional instructional support, but in this example, that would leave Fort King Middle with 1 counselor for 1,500 students. So moving forward, although we're drastically improving the ratios now, potentially down the line, we're setting ourselves up to create a an increase in those ratios, which isn't the goal of what I've heard today. To create that consistency with the ratios in time, this could potentially harm those ratios significantly. And I have concern with that, as our school counselors are one of the 3 identified mental health providers in statute. In this day and age, with the mental health support that's needed, that potentially down the road, not saying it would happen, but if the principal had the autonomy to make that decision, because of the difficulty in finding certified school counselors, it would be easy for a principal to turn that into another unit, which would then severely harm those ratios and that support that school counselors can provide down the road. Not necessarily now, because we're adding several more units, which is good in the short term, but that would just be a concern I would have moving forward.
So since we're talking guidance counselors, and we'll get back to high school, while you're here, let's talk a bit more about the elementary and the middle school, because overall, you're right, there's a significant increase in guidance counselor support through this. Do you see the need for elementary school counselors in the way we have included them from a ratio perspective? Because my understanding of guidance counselors at the high school level, certainly basically 1 to 500 students or so is our ratio there at the highest, then that they're ensuring we're working with graduations, we're working with ensuring that they're following their requirements for what they need, and in elementary school, most of us grew up with one guidance counselor in our entire elementary school, regardless of how large the school population was. So I'm interested in knowing a bit more about how you feel specifically on elementary school ratios, with us considering adding 18 guidance counselors.
Well, I'll start by saying I do believe that it's needed, and I hope that I can articulate my thoughts well here. But at a school, it's, like I mentioned before, it's all hands on deck. So the more staff you have, lessens the load for everyone involved. At the elementary level, if you have a school with, let's say, 700 students, and you have one school counselor, that school counselor is not just doing school duties. They're a team player, they're part of the school community, so they're involved in many other different activities on campus. And so if you add a second unit, then that will not only, it'll lighten the load for everything else that they may be involved in. But particular with school counseling task, when you have a ratio of 1 to 700 and now you're at 350, for example, it just provides more opportunity, more time that you can spend. Just another example, and I know you asked about elementary, but just an example of Fort King again. So right now the ratio is about 540 students per counselor. If I, on average, met with 10 students a day, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you add in lunch duty and bus duty and anything else that counselors help with, if I'm able to see 10 students a day, I'm not seeing every student on my caseload to the 54th day of school. That means I'm seeing every student on campus 3 times a year, 15, 20 minutes. So from my perspective, that's where the ratios really matter. So the national recommended ratio, which I know no state or district is close to, it's 1 to 250 students. So we're not quite double that now. This would significantly reduce that, but that's where the value would come in, is that it's more interaction with those students and those families, the lower that ratio can be. But it's also, I think, more valuable that, just like the intent of this ability to turn it into another unit, even if that remains another counselor, counselors do above and beyond what's in their job description. They're helping with many other factors on a school campus. So if you're able to hire another unit, and most of what I've been able to see at the elementary level, we're going from 1 unit to 2, because most of our elementary schools are above 500. We're between the 500 and 800 mark. So most of our elementary schools will go from 1 to 200. That additional person not only helps with the ratios for the school counseling task, but also the workload on campus, which I think is what the caveat is trying to address. It's another instructional person on campus to lighten the load of the other things that we have to do to make a school function.
Thank you, Mr. McGowan. Additional questions for Mr. McGowan, board?
Thank you, Ms. McGowan. I strongly believe that school counselors are vital, especially as the kids progress upward through their academic career, I think that you can't. I ask questions. I ask a lot of questions of parents and students, and I ask them, how often do you talk to your counselors? How often do you have the ability to talk to your counselors? Some kids have never had the opportunity to talk to their counselors because the caseloads are so great. So I think by us, this board being proactive and looking at these numbers, sometimes I think we don't understand how important those counselors are, because it could start helping kids at an early age start getting on the right path and setting themselves up for success in taking the right track of classes if they're going to college or if they're going to the military or whatever, or getting scholarships, all those types of things. So I'm glad that this board is deciding to look at how those caseloads are dispersed and making sure that we're adequately addressing it. I know that national average is, what'd you say, 250?
Yes, sir. No one's close to that.
Nobody's across the country is probably reaching that. That would be great if we could one day get there, but I think we need to try to move in that direction instead of away from that direction. So thank you for talking about that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. McGowan. I think that it's interesting whenever we start thinking of the impact potentially of an increase in school counselors at our elementary school. Would it be having that forward impact on potentially reduction of discipline issues at the middle school level if there is relationship built at the elementary school level, mental health services being able to be taught and offered earlier on based on caseload? That's something we haven't looked at from a data perspective because it's not something that we've ever incorporated into our plan. So thank you for that. It's a valuable perspective.
Chair.
Yes, Vice Chair.
Thank you. And yes, thank you, Mr. McGowan. And just a quick confirmation, at the elementary level, guidance counselors truly serve as the gateway, I think, to services. Is that accurate? And like you said, thinking forward and being proactive, if a student early on has that contact and interaction, then that triggers all kinds of planning and supports for students. We have a lot of kids where it takes too much time. The whole timeline of identifying, first of all, realizing there's a problem, then identifying the need, and then, having all the meetings, and then, getting them the services. So if we can do more to ensure that process happens earlier, that lines up completely with all of the early indicators of success and everything that we talk about of what's going to position kids for success moving forward and hopefully keep them out of very restrictive environments.
Vice Chair Thorne, and thank you for saying that, because you just jogged my memory on something, and I'm just trying to recollect. They are a part of the IEP team, correct? The guidance counselor, not the guidance counselor, the counselor, because some of that stuff they initiate. Am I saying that right, Mr. McGowan?
They sure can.
They are a part of it. They are part of the IEP, and that helps us with. I get a lot of things saying my kid hasn't been assessed for ESC and for all these other things, but the guidance counselor plays a major. That's one of their duties, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the misconceptions too, is when we hear the word counselor, we're thinking of sitting in our office, meeting with students one-on-one all day. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's participation on IEP teams, facilitating 504 meetings, participating on the multidisciplinary team, being part of the team that does suicide and threat assessments, working with students in crisis. It's all of that. And to Ms. Rivers' point, they're a lot of times the conduit between the school and community agencies that they need to loop in to assist and provide support to the student. And it could even be through the multidisciplinary team process, working with our social workers and our contracted mental health counselors to provide that more in-depth counseling if needed, things like that. So a lot of times they are bridging that gap between, the students' needs and the services that are available. Absolutely.
Thank you. I remember I've said on many IEPs, and I just thought, I was like, wait a minute, that's a part of that that ESE IEP
Absolutely.
product. And oftentimes we keep saying we kind of get behind on some of those things, but they can help initiate.
Absolutely. And to your point you made earlier about, and Ms. Thrower, it's about the proactiveness versus the reactiveness. And that's what school counselors provide. Whether it be with student discipline, student behaviors, academic, at the high school level, that's certainly where we've always strived to move those students to whatever their post-secondary goals are. However, when you have a caseload of 500 or 600 students that you're trying to make sure at a minimum, and our goal isn't the minimum, but at a minimum, we need students to meet graduation requirements to graduate. And when we're tracking 500, 600 students to make sure that happens, it is very difficult to have meaningful time to have conversations with post-secondary plans. And so that's naturally, by lowering the ratios, that helps facilitate more time for those conversations.
And that's been an age-old problem.
Absolutely.
I can remember going here at high school. I saw my high school counselor 3 times in all 4 years. Once when I came in, once in 10th grade, and the one time my senior year to find out what I was going to do after high school. So I'm praying we're at a much better place than that now, and hopefully this will help.
Agreed. So while Mr. McGowan's there and while we're talking counselors, let's get back to high school in just a moment, but let's go ahead and address counselors across the board since we're there. So what this looks like based on the numbers we've been given, guidance counselor numbers will not change at high school because they're already set based on ratio. The question of what Mr. McGowan had noted is the words in blue right now that say may substitute for instructional support for allocations greater than 4. That's what it says at the high school level. Are we comfortable with removing that per Mr. McGowan's commentary?
Removing it at the high school or removing it altogether?
Well, this one specifically at the high school is, so that's why I'm starting there and then I'm working backwards, because this one is specifically at substituting it for instructional support at greater than 4. So at high school, they automatically have 4 based on this. But if they had going up, then they could substitute for instructional support. Should we?
Unless there are planned retirements or job vacancies for high school for next school year, it's null because they won't be able to exchange with an existing person sitting in the guidance counselor position, right, Ms. Morant? So you can get rid of it this year and we can talk about it next year for high school because again, unless the job is going to become vacant, it's impossible to happen.
Okay, so then let's take it off for high school because it doesn't matter based on what we're talking about. Okay, so at middle school, it does say may substitute for instructional support for allocations greater than 1.
Yeah, might as well get his thoughts on middle and elementary.
Right, so based on middle school and these ratios, what it looks like for us is we would be adding guidance counselors at 2 schools, but we would not have any reduction. We do have reductions in guidance clerks. So is guidance clerk a support to a guidance counselor, or is that some different position that doesn't fall under mental health?
But we keep just saying guidance counselor is school counselor.
School counselor, yes.
Right, but it's school counselor on the staffing plan, guidance counselor on this plan. So I think
They're synonymous.
they're
right?
synonymous, I believe.
Are they?
The new term is school counselor.
Okay.
Okay.
It used to be guidance counselor, but it's
Okay.
Provide
so-
guidance and all kinds of other stuff.
Thank you.
Yes,
So on,
yes.
on this spreadsheet we have, we'll change that to school counselor. Thank you for that correction.
In my opinion, I think looking at this, the bigger concern is probably at the middle school level. I think at the elementary level, when we get to 700, 800, 900 students, I think our schools know the value in having 2 school counselors there. One cannot manage that. High school, we've established, I think that's appropriately staffed. Middle school is where my concern would lie, because if you have a situation where a school is just under the number for an additional unit, the concern is where it says anything more than 1 allocation. So high school, it's 4, anything above 4. Elementary is 1, but then middle school is still 1. So if they have 3 school counselors or 4 in the future, then I could potentially have 4 counselors and then in the future go down to 1. Whereas at the elementary example, it still has to have an allocation of 1. So if the max I have is 2, I choose to use 1 for another function, I have 1 counselor. But, so that's an impact, but not as significant as if I had 4 counselors at middle, and now I go down to 1.
So
That
would you
makes sense.
recommend the substitution allocation of greater than 3? Or just remove the line altogether that the substitution allocation is not allowed at all?
Well, personally, my opinion would be to remove it altogether, to protect our school counselors and the work that they do. However, that being said, I'm sympathetic to what our principals mentioned and where they're at, because there's other support that's needed, and I fully recognize that, and I don't want to diminish that. But from a school counselor perspective, we wouldn't want to do all the work we're doing now to recognize the need to lower the ratios, and then by something we put in default later, then that's, all that work is undone. So if a school is used to having 3 school counselors at a middle school, for example, and then all of a sudden we go down to 1, now granted, that would be the principal's prerogative to make that decision, and I understand that, but we're still going down from 3 school counselors to 1, and what that would impact for the counseling services that we provide.
If I may, I just want, if the alternative is to have a vacancy, which is better?
Certainly to fill it.
Okay. And if it has to be filled with someone who's either willing to sign an out of field or has the qualifications, and that someone doesn't exist, then it will be vacant unless we add this asterisk. And then there will be no value in having the extra unit because it will be unfillable. Because if we have, how many guidance counselor or school counselor vacancies do we have in this exact moment? Or in your most recent recollection?
None at this moment. We have 2 that are funded through the mental health allocation that are not filled. But to your point, we have several of our school counselors that are out of field that, to Chair Campbell's point, did come out of the classroom. And that's a legitimate concern. I did that when I was a counselor. I was a teacher, became a counselor, and went out of field. And it takes those individuals that have a passion for that work. It's not additional pay or anything like that. But to your point, certainly we'd want it to be filled for the benefit of the school. My concern would only be if, let's say we have 2 units, it would be very easy, because it can be difficult to fill those positions, to not have a good faith effort to fill that with a school counselor and turn it into another unit, which if that's what the school needs, completely understand that, but then we are taking away from the counseling services that we've identified as a need.
Can we just change then from saying 1 to 2 so that there is a 2 requirement, and the individuals that are adding beyond 2 would be able to sub out that 3rd for a testing coordinator or whatever if they deemed it appropriate and necessary?
Like I say, for me, the middle school is a bigger concern because there could be such a drop-off in support because it only says an allocation of 1.
I'm more comfortable with greater than 3, frankly. If we're saying greater, if we originally, even though we just said we take it off, if we originally said greater than 4 at the high school level, and you're telling me that middle school is the area that you're most concerned about, then I don't want to have the opportunity for those that potentially have 3 or 4 to be able to go down to 1, and I think that's the concern you're expressing. So if we gave them the opportunity to sub for instructional support for allocations greater than 3, then that would impact how many schools? 1?
I'm also seeing it an incorrection though too. Bellevue Middle, do they have three school counselors or 4?
They currently have 3. When I reviewed ratios personally yesterday, based off the ratios, I believe they should have 4, but I believe it's only indicated to have 3.
You should have another.
So that's just something I noticed on here that I think is an oversight.
They're at 1546 on a.
So they would be gaining, they would be a +1 as well, in addition to Fort King and Lake Weir. Is that correct?
They're listing on their website, they have a 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade coordinators, or counselors, school counselors, so that is 3. And based on the unit allocations, it does look like they would be adding a guidance, or school counselor. Gotta get that word.
So Chair Campbell, then the recommendation of 3 or more, it would only impact Bellevue Middle in that situation, because that would be the only one that would be at 4.
So then do we want to
Currently.
say greater than 2?
That would be my suggestion.
I would say greater than 2.
Greater than 2? Okay. You have consensus on that for middle school, and then at elementary school, while we still have Mr. McGowan. The ratios here, the cost for this, for 18 additional guidance counselors is 1.3 million. I'm not saying the need isn't there, I'm just interested in knowing if the ratios are where they need to be on that. Granted, we just heard that 1 to 250 is the national recommendation, but just trying to be fiscally responsible while still doing what's best for students.
I personally, I think it's appropriate. When I ran the numbers, as we currently sit with our current staffing of school counselors at elementary, we're at 1 to 473 students as a ratio. With the proposed new units, we've reduced that to 1 to 352. Obviously, that's going to vary, by school, but you could potentially argue that the range between 500 and, I don't have it here, whatever the next threshold is, but anything over 500 to me at the elementary level could certainly warrant 2 school counselors.
Right.
We have some that are right at that number, or maybe 600, but then we have just as many, if not more, that are at the higher end of that threshold, the 7 going up to 800, that before now just had the 1 school counselor.
Okay. So based on the ratios, we do have several additions that we would be making here. This also has the line about substituting instructional support for allocations greater than 1. I think that we may have just landed on greater than 2. Are we sticking with that, or are we going with 1 for elementary?
I'm just going to offer again that I think we will find ourselves in a position where we are posting positions that we can't fill, and if we have to decide, is it more important to have the guidance counselor regardless of what that looks like, or do we want that principal to be able to fill that vacancy with someone who could serve as a testing coordinator or CAS instead?
So allowing elementary schools to substitute for instructional support for allocations greater than 1. So for a school that has 975 students, they would have 1 guidance counselor perhaps.
Which is what they have now.
Right.
That's high.
Which we know there's a need.
Right. So this is where we say, I understand your point, Dr. James, I do, whether we have a vacant position or not, and also understanding the concern that all of these 18 positions potentially are all coming out of classrooms and we don't have teachers to fill them. So what does that look like for us? And the cost is $1.3 million.
Yes, ma'am. I certainly see the argument. You could take as just an example, Fort McCoy K-5, Fort McCoy at 561. So they're just over the threshold of 500. So yes, you could certainly argue that if we keep it at anything above 1, so maybe 1 school counselor could fill the need for 561 and use the other unit for something else. But then that threshold is large. So then you go to a school like NH Jones with 792. And that's not suitable or capable for 1 person. So.
Greater than 2.
But didn't we also just speak to the fact, board, that we want principals to be able to make that decision and give them flexibility? And if that principal feels like that counselor is meeting the needs of that 749 students, and taking testing off of that guidance counselor's docket would free up their time to provide the counseling that they're supposed to, and then adding an additional person whose sole responsibility is to do testing coordinator and meet in small groups and do those things. We just spoke to that. We want to offer principals that flexibility. So hand tying them to, it has to be 2 counselors regardless, is taking away that flexibility that we were just speaking about trying to offer them. And so if the principal thinks that it would be more appropriate to post a different position, then I think we should afford the principal that instructional leadership opportunity.
the good things about all of this is that we can certainly trial it and get the feedback. Dr. James, you make a great point. We want to provide the flexibility for principals to do what they need to do in real time and get what they need as proactively as possible. So for elementary, and I also am honoring what Mr. McGowan is saying as well, because what we're trying to do is find a way to support as best we can for our current situation.
So, and Dr. James, I agree with you. I mean, I think at the elementary level, if that principal deems that the way their school is functioning, that one is appropriate and they want to use the other unit, then I sympathize with that, and I understand that. I think my bigger concern, like I mentioned, was at middle school, because the threshold was still at one allocation. And that would cause such a dramatic decrease in services from school counselors, where that we wouldn't see that decrease in elementary or high. So if we make the adjustment for middle school, I think that was my bigger concern, because we could, it's just such the caseload would just increase so dramatically if they decided to change multiple units rather than one.
I have one other question. Does Sunrise have 2 counselors currently or 1?
2.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I really identify with what you said, Mr. McGowan, because, we know that 48% of our discipline referrals are coming from middle school. Where each area of education is very different. So I think that we're doing the right thing to recognize that and adjust accordingly. Dr. Gullett, I'm interested to hear.
Thank you, Vice Chair Thrower. I think that major concern that I just keep thinking about is the classroom teacher. I think that they are going to come from somewhere, and I think the vacancies are going to be a real issue. Certainly value and appreciate Mr. McGowan and the advocacy for guidance, and I think we all agree that we need that, but we're in a very difficult time with vacancies, and the workforce is not flowing into our schools. So it's a tough decision. I think that having a bare minimum, yes, but having some flexibility is what I continue to hear from the principals, right? So if you're forced with not having an ability to make a decision because I can't fill that, then they're not getting additional support. I think that is the priority. If you have to make a decision, if you land with where can we get the most support to our schools with the conditions that we're in.
So then leaving the line of substituting instructional support for allocations greater than 1 would land us where these schools would need the flexibility.
Yes, I would support that for elementary.
Okay. And while we completely understand that these positions potentially will be coming out of the classroom at the end of the day, when we're looking at 2,500 potentially teachers, 18 of them is a number. It's just not, we're not saying 150 people are coming out of the classroom to serve in this role. So granted, they're going to come from somewhere, and perhaps allocating additional guidance counselor resources. I know multiple students that I am teaching right now in college that are all going into mental health and sociology, and that's all, they're really interested in mental health counseling, and just steering them into classrooms with kids is the direction we're going to need to go. So, okay, thank you, Mr. McGowan. I appreciate that. So it appears that we have landed, at least in the school counselor realm, understanding what that cost looks like, but that's where we are.
Chair Campbell, may I
Yes.
just confirm for middle school, did we land on, they may sub for instructional support for allocations greater than 2 or 3?
2.
2, thank you.
And elementary stayed at 1.
And then we're moving high school.
You can leave it at greater than 4 if you want, just so they all look the same. But, based on the conversation we had, it's not going to be impactful for this next year anyway.
So would you like me to leave it or remove it for high school?
Do you want to leave it or?
I think we said remove it, because we can always circle back to the conversation next year.
All right, let's remove it for high school.
Thank you.
So, finishing up our high school conversation. So, back on these allocations. So, for the guidance clerk, so I do have a question, because especially at the middle school level, well, I know we're talking high school, but specifically at middle school, we're losing a lot of guidance clerks. And so I'm not sure what that looks like, but at the high school level, there would be one guidance clerk that we would be losing. So perhaps I need a little more clarification on what a guidance clerk's position is.
Chair, if I may, where Westport loses the clerk but adds the clerk generalist, which is actually a more general position than the guidance clerk. So when I spoke to Ms. Morant and the principals, they would actually prefer to have the clerk generalist on their staffing plan because it's a more universal position and not as specific to one specific role. So at Westport, she would simply be able to, that individual who's living as the guidance clerk would transition into a clerk generalist and would have an opportunity to have a more flexible job description.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, Dr. Jameson. So based on, just if I'm using the numbers right here, it looks like the cost would be a $20,000 increase. Because if we're having a reduction of a guidance clerk at $37,500, then we would have it would be for 2 clerk generalists for $20,000 increase. Okay, I'm just trying to do some math. Mr. McGowan, do you want to speak specifically to the clerk general, or guidance clerk, because we will be talking about that for middle schools?
Sure, yes, ma'am. And I can only speak from my personal experience, but the 2 guidance clerks that I worked with were in direct support of the guidance office. So I worked at a high school, and so we had 2 guidance clerks. So that ranged from when students came in to see a counselor, they would welcome them, have them sign in, et cetera. When parents came in to register students, they took the registration process from that point all the way through the counselor's meeting with the family to schedule them, maintaining all of the school cumulative folders. So it really was in support of the guidance office and the functions of the guidance department. But I do understand that role could vary and look differently on different campuses, depending on other support staff. But in my experience, that is the role of the guidance clerk.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McGowan. So on the proposal we have in draft version 3, it does show that we would put in ratios specific to guidance clerks, and with that, we actually would be losing 5 units in 1 each in Dunellen, Horizon, Howard, North Marion Middle, and Osceola Middle. So based on that dialogue, I mean, I do think we have just none of those schools are impacted based on the guidance school counselor conversation we just had. But all of them would be losing that support personnel at the middle school level.
Didn't we just have a long conversation about?
I know, the middle school is where we need it the most. So then we have to figure out if we're not going to base it on ratios, what are we basing it on?
Need.
And how do we dictate that on a school staffing plan? Need, not numbers, is what Mr. Johnson said, but how do you put that?
How do you quantify?
How do you quantify that? Which is philosophically why I disagree with school staffing plans. Can I say that again? So what does that look like? Obviously all of this money, the total cost of what all of this is going to look like is going to be significantly more than what we had originally budgeted for, so we know that already. But removing the guidance clerks here was going to get us a bit of that back, but I hear that middle school is where we need the most guidance support.
And just a note in that same conversation, our guidance clerks are at 8 hours, and our clerk generalist works 6 hours. Just to have that as a part of your conversation.
Okay, so let me go back to this then. So a guidance clerk at 8 hours, and we were losing 1, so their salary is roughly $37,500, just looking here. So then a clerk generalist must be,
Clerk generalist, $28,576.70.
and they're a 6-hour employee. That's interesting. So could we split the difference? Hear me out. Could we transfer those 5 positions from a guidance clerk to a clerk generalist? And that would save us almost 10,000 a person. I mean, we're going pennies here. I mean, but just trying to figure out how to be fiscally responsible.
I wonder how the middle schools would feel about that, thinking along the lines of a clerk generalist having, being a more flexible type position. Would that help them or hurt them?
It's not a question I asked. And I don't know that we can get an answer. I don't know if Mr. Fraser wants to speak to that. Like, I don't know how we could get that information from them. Just trying to figure out, I mean, if we're using ratios, then we have to figure out what that looks like. And Mr. Fraser, only if you have something to add that can help in this conversation. I'm not trying to put you on the spot for sure.
No, I would just take it back to what our particular Mr. Johnson was referencing. Overall as a whole, when we start thinking about reduction of support, I think that that's a consideration. We all know that when we're adding things, we have to take something away somewhere, but I'm not sure middle schools are the best route at this point, looking at the discipline data and the mental health needs that we're seeing at the middle school level right now.
I think I concur with that. So then what does it look like on a school staffing plan? Because if we're not using ratios, what are we using? How did it look before? Let's see.
So I was going back to version 1 in middle school for guidance clerks, 1 through 199, they would receive 2. And 2,000 plus, they would receive 3. And that's on version 1, and we did not change that from what we have currently.
So if we went back to that version 1 for middle school guidance clerks to be at 2 guidance clerks for 1 to 1,999 students and 3 for 2,000 plus students.
Correct.
Personally, I think I'm more comfortable with that.
Especially based on the conversation of this morning from the folks that are facilitating this work. And that's why having these follow-up work sessions are so important. You know, you start with a framework and there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of conversation generated, there's a lot of new knowledge that comes to that. Some of this is going to circle back around to where we started. I don't consider that a waste of time. I consider that a confirmation. And also, then there's new thinking that comes up that we've been able to make some adjustments, again, based on hearing from the people that are living this every day. So I'm okay with it.
Dr. James, Reverend Cummings,
I'm good.
you're good?
Yeah, if that's the pleasure of everybody, that's fine with me.
Okay, so that's that guidance clerk position. So I think we've figured that out because that's not an impact. Okay. So we're kind of hopping all over the place, but we're trying to check things off.
getting there.
We're getting there. We are getting there. So we're keeping track. Okay, back to high school again, because I would like to wrap this high school up and then we can move on. So we do have the addition of the clerk generalists. We just talked about the guidance clerk, so we would not lose the guidance clerk. Granted, that conversation we had was about middle school, but I think we could probably say our high school could use it as well, and that's only 1. And then the clerk generalist, we would be adding 2, and I'm just double checking to see where we were on that originally.
Madam Chair, just for clarification,
Please.
we will use version 1 of guidance clerk for high school as well, correct? We won't make any changes there.
I believe that's
Okay.
where we were just talking, yes.
Thank you.
Guidance clerk, I'm just looking again. So this is middle school. Where's my high school one? Here it is. So clerk generalist was 1 person, no, generalist, guidance clerk, 1 to 9. Yes, use those same ratios.
Okay, perfect.
That we had on the original for high school for guidance clerk.
We'll be back to 2, 3, 4, and 4.
Yes, 2, 3, and 4. That's what those numbers were. Now on to the clerk generalist. This was on the original plan to go with the 2 at 2,000 plus students. So based on that being on the original plan, I think we leave that as is. Okay, and then the last thing to discuss is the ESOL paraprofessionals. And this is something that I feel strongly in, and I believe Ms. Hughes is basing it now on the ELL population band specifically for high school. And if she wants to clarify any more, terrific. Otherwise, I know that this cost is going to be upwards of $371,000, but these 12 additional people at the high school level seem to be a need for our principals and our schools there.
I do know this, Chair, is that including in IEP meetings, you need an interpreter, someone that can, or a translator, I should say. So, and if we don't have these dedicated people, then you're trying to grab somebody from somewhere to be able to translate. So that's a kind of a real world example of the need that I've experienced directly.
Okay, so I think we're wrapped up with high school.
May I just repeat it? I just want to ensure I have it correctly. So for high school, each high school will, they'll still receive their allocation of 1 APC, 1 API, 1 APD. They will receive an additional API for enrollment of 2,000 or more, and then another additional for 2,500 or more. When we're looking at school counselors, we're going to keep the same ratios that we have listed under version 3, but we're going to remove the line that says that they may sub for instructional support for allocations greater than 1. That will be removed. The guidance clerks, we're going to go back to their original allocation, but we're going to keep the addition of the clerk generalist of an additional 1 at 2,000 or more, and then also keeping the suggested ESOL paraprofessional based on the ELL population band. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
So we'll have to see what those actual numbers are, but it's probably going to be, I'm going to say roughly 800,000 as opposed to the 955 that we were looking at. Give or take a bit. There may be, it may be a little bit under that 800, maybe 750. Just looking at where we're adding, and Ms. Boston-Ellis is going to figure all this out for us. Thank you, Ms. Boston-Ellis. Thank you, Ms. Morant. Okay, moving on to middle school. So what have we already talked through at the middle school level? So, board, I know that I am not comfortable with removing assistant principals from our smaller schools. So I think going back to the original plan might actually, the 1 APC and 1 APD per middle school, and then an additional AP. We can talk about staffing at this point. I think each middle school needs an APC and an APD across the board, and then let's figure out what the ratio is to get your third and potentially fourth. What did we just do for high school?
If I could just offer, if the conversation for high school surrounded around North Marion High School slipping below 1,200 and they can't afford to lose their third AP, then I would offer the number needs to be 1,200 for them to get a third at middle school. If that is the number that we were holding to for high school, that same need would be present in middle school.
And the original plan for middle school was their third came at 1,500. And so we had adjusted it down to a third AP for 1,200. So that would, and let's see. So at this point, Bellevue Middle has 2, but we think based on the numbers, they should have 3.
They would be pushing needing 4.
If we went with the draft 3 plan. The proposal from the original conversation was to have a third at 1,500 and let that be the, and board it, it's up to us if we want to make that number 1,500 or if we want to reduce that 1,200, 1,300, whatever that number might be. At this point, the two that would be impacted if we're over 1,300 for a third assistant principal would be Liberty Middle and Bellevue Middle. So do we want to make the number 1,300 for another AP?
I'm less concerned about what we're doing at high school than I am about the conversation around specifically what we need to do to support middle school. I would share that Liberty Middle School for sure needs more support. So let's make the decision based on, you know, the needs of the actual situations.
So around the original conversation was 1,500 plus, they would receive an extra assistant principal, but it said they may substitute for instructional support, is the way it was originally presented to us.
With the rezoning that's going to occur, Liberty may fall below 1,300, which would then disqualify them if we set the number at 1,300.
Okay.
So if we set the number at, I'm going to just go back to the point I just made. If 1,200 is the magic number for high school, then 1,200 should be the magic number for middle school. We just had Mr. Johnson and Mr. Frazier share that middle school probably has the deepest needs of any singular group. So if the number is 1,200, the number, in my opinion, is 1,200.
And I appreciate that, Dr. James, but the magic number for high school is no longer 1,200 because we just adjusted it.
But your point was that if North Marion Middle slid below the 1,200 number, they would still need to maintain their three assistant principal units. So in theoretical sense, the number is 1,200, because if North Marion Middle can't slide below that or they would lose, then that's important to reference. And so the number of instructional units that need to be observed, the number of students that require testing, all of those things are the same number in all of the secondary places.
And then you have the matter of the discipline. So I would say at least, you know, at the max 1,200 for middle school until those discipline numbers change.
So going back to the original look, that assistant principals at middle school, we would have one APC and one APD. And then at 1,200 plus, they would receive a third.
But then also at 1,700, they would receive a fourth.
Okay?
Because Bellevue High School is quickly approaching. Now, whether he has the capacity to hit 1,700, but, you know, he is,
Yeah, that'd be middle.
who's to know what those conversations will entail? So I would say we should at least include it so that,
Right, we can only plan for the now and trying to project a little bit too. But yes, I agree with your point.
Okay. So that has us at the assistant principal, closer to what we had originally presented, but still with additional numbers based on ratios. Moving on from there, the school counselor conversation, I think we have had, as well as the guidance clerk conversation we have had. The bookkeeper question, I am looking for my notes on that. We have it right now set at 1,300 plus students would receive a bookkeeper. I wonder if we bring that down to 1,200, since we're going with that number for the AP. I know that if given the opportunity, dependent on a couple of factors there, that if that position could be traded also, if we substituted it for something else. But I know as you become a middle school that's larger than some of our high schools, becomes a significant burden on a secretary to manage all the bookkeeping.
Chair.
Yes.
Yes, and while that's true, I know that some of our smaller high schools, they have a lot of money flowing through their internal accounts just by the nature of being a high school. So I don't know, this is definitely not an area at all of expertise for me, what a bookkeeper at middle school handles compared to a bookkeeper at high school. So I would need more information to really be able to weigh in with any more expertise than what I just shared.
So the conversation I had with both of these principals who would be impacted, I think we honestly could change the number to 1,500, because I do think, again, whenever you have a middle school that's larger than, almost half of our high schools, then they are dealing with a lot of internal accounts. But to that point also, with RevTrak being introduced, that does offer electronic record keeping more so than we've ever had before. So there's not as many checks coming in and cash coming in and that kind of thing. So, but with sports fees and club fees and, there's still a lot going on there. I just, at 1,500, I guess my question is, at 1,500 plus students, can a confidential secretary do all of the work of a confidential secretary in addition to the bookkeeping responsibilities for a school of 1,500 students?
No.
Okay, so then the question is, can a school of 1,200 students do that? And so that's where I am. Is the ratio 1,300, or is it 1,500, or is it 1,200? What does that look like? I think the answer at 1,500 absolutely is no, but I'm curious to know. In speaking with the other principal impacted, they didn't, don't want to call a principal out specifically, but it didn't seem as significant of a need at less than 1,500 students. How does it please the board?
I think it needs to be 1,200.
Vice Chair, Reverend Cummings, thoughts?
Yeah, I can go for a reduction. I'm just kind of a little uncomfortable with all this because we asked all of them to bring these numbers in. We're just picking them apart. But I do see the need in some of this, but we got to get this done. So.
And we're really close. So, bookkeeper, where do we want to be? The sooner we make this decision, that much closer we'll be.
Dr. Gullett, is there something that we might be missing that would help this?
Thank you, Vice Chair. I don't see the difference between the 1,200 and 1,300. I think I heard consistency with the other number. There's a reason for that, right? But I don't think the impact changes allocations, correct? The school, as I'm looking at the data.
Based on the 100-day membership numbers, but we know that may change based on allocations. But right now, whether we do 1,200 or 1,300, we're looking at two schools with
Okay.
receivable.
So really, it's just the preference of the board, and if you wanted, I think, similar number to another allocation.
My question was if we went not to 1,200 or 1,300, but we actually went it to 1,500. That was my question.
Liberty would no longer be included.
Right. And my again, not trying to call a principal out. I don't know that it's a need there.
So to the question, this is something that I have personally heard directly from principals about. I've actually talked to people out in the field about this, and this has come up as a pattern, even in my roundtables and in face-to-face. I'm thinking about our audits and being very mindful of that being a key aspect of what we need to do and be responsible with those audits. And I think it's important to make sure that we are responsible to have folks in there that can get that work done appropriately. We have a responsibility to our citizens to do that. So I support keeping the bookkeepers, whether it's 1,200 or 1,300, I'm okay with. I would not recommend them going higher.
Okay.
So can we agree to 1,300?
12, did you say 1,200?
13.
13.
My only reservation was the same for the assistant principals, that if we rezone Liberty and she falls below 1,300, then she would be disqualified from the whole purpose of the AP and the bookkeeper that we're adding. And we don't know what those rezoning numbers will look like yet, and we're yet to have that final conversation, but that would be something I would think about in future planning. If we made it 1,200, then we would ensure, more than likely, that we would encompass Liberty regardless of the rezoning numbers.
Okay, I'm comfortable with 1,200.
1,200.
1,200 it is on
That's a good
bookkeeper.
point.
All right, and ESOL paraprofessionals, based on the new ratios, show us losing ESOL paras at the middle school level. That would be losing an ESOL para at Horizon, losing one at Liberty, and losing one at Osceola, based on anticipated population bands. I struggle with that
I
one.
do too. 'Cause there's the 10-day count, you know. There's going to be time if those are positions that haven't been filled and the numbers don't make anyway, then that decision can be taken care of at that time. But I certainly don't want to signal to any school, especially, I just don't want to signal to any school that we're preparing not to provide support.
I'm not comfortable with removing ESOL paras. I think you all heard me say that. We got them all added to high school, so, but Dr. James, Reverend Cummings, how do you feel about ESOL paras at the middle school level?
There's still a need. The need doesn't change because they move from middle school to high school or elementary to middle. So if there's still a need there, we need them.
So if we add back in the ratio of the 1 to 17 for ESOL paras, that will get us back to, I think, the full staffing on that. Okay. Ms. Morant?
That's
we-
using the population band that she presented in elementary school.
It goes back to the original population band,
It
or
was a
the,
different one for high school, right?
yes.
That's what I'm hearing. We will use the population band for high school and go back to the 1 to 17 ratio for elementary and middle, is what I think I'm
Yes.
hearing. Okay.
Yes. So that has us not losing any ESOL paras at any level.
And it would have been a $91,179 reduction if I'm reading this correctly, right?
At the middle school.
Yes.
level.
Yes, and for the potential impact that they can provide in that position to our kids and their success. I just think that that's continues to be money well spent, if we can find them.
Before moving to elementary, may I just go over middle school to make sure I've captured everything?
Please.
Okay, so for middle school, the APs, much like we did with high school, we'll go back to the original with one APC, one APD. However, for enrollment of 1,200 or more, they will get an additional one. And then a fourth one or another additional with enrollment of 1,700 or more. The bookkeeper, we will keep that, but we will change that enrollment number to 1,200. With the counselors, we already addressed that, and changing that they can sub for allocations greater than 2. I went out of order, sorry about that. The guidance clerks, we will revert back to that original staffing ratio. And for ESOL paras, we will keep them at 1 to 17, not using the band. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, elementary is all we have left.
Elementary, my dear Chair.
So we already had conversation about school counselor. In that conversation, we discussed that they would be able to substitute for instructional support for allocations greater than 1. We already discussed ESOL paras because we're going back to the 1 to 17 ratio. The only other, well, okay, I am in full support of adding a third PE teacher when our school enrollment is over 1,000. So I'm in full support of that. Right now, we only have one school that would be impacted by that, but we're hovering close to those numbers at some other schools. The guidance clerk, I think we had conversation about guidance clerk as well. That once you reach a certain, I think the ratios for elementary school on guidance clerk look decent to me. I think there's only an impact of one additional guidance clerk there. And then the, let's see, permanent substitute. So where was permanent substitute on this staffing plan?
Be on the second page of version 2. Well, number page 4, but second page for elementary.
Okay. And the
Originally, they only received one per school, but the version 3 proposal is an additional one if they, for every 10 plus self-contained units. I'm sorry, if they have 10 or more self-contained units, they would receive a second permanent sub.
that seems like a significant need to me.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? So we're going to keep that in, and the last conversation is about kindergarten paras. My only conversation, and I know that we have some very strong opinions on kindergarten paras, but whenever I look to adding 3, 4, or 6 people on campuses, I question if it's possible that we split the difference. While it wouldn't be a 1-to-1 ratio, it could still be adding people to campuses without necessarily adding the significant number that we're looking at a 1-to-1 ratio. And that's honestly where I'm going to land on that, and we can continue to have conversation.
Chair,
Yes.
I hear what you're saying, and I would say that until we have paraprofessionals that are no longer teaching regularly in our classrooms, that I think we need more of them, not less of them. Maybe there can be some best practice around the use of paraprofessionals, that early in the season, having them directed to kindergarten to really get the kids on a good track is valid. And then giving principals also that flexibility, because we know it's happening anyway, for them to utilize them as needed across other areas. I love the idea of where it's possible, depending on the school and how the kids are doing on their kindergarten skills, being able to transition some of those paras into those higher grades to help prepare them for testing and MTSS and all of that. They have been the backbone and the soldiers to get us through, and it's still happening. We also, on a very exciting note, have quite a few that have thrown their hats in the ring to become teachers. We're growing our own, and this gives them that opportunity as well to really get a chance to see what it's like in more than just one type of classroom. So my short story on what I just said is that kindergarten really does matter. We all know that. We need to put our money where our mouths are and where the data shows it needs to be driven. And then when there are, and providing that flexibility for principals where the kids are coming up and doing well, to be able to have them help in other areas. That's where I am with that. But I would not support cutting.
I agree with Ms. Thrower. I think it needs to be 1-to-1, and if there's a way we can create flexibility around them being used in other places when necessary and deemed by the principal, I think that would be great. But only takes one day in a kindergarten class to understand the need of a kindergarten parent.
You're so cute.
All right, sound like we have consensus. Can we move on?
Yes.
That's it.
Okay. Now let me repeat elementary, if you don't mind. So we will maintain the ratios that are presented on version 3 for the APs. We've already addressed school counselors. We'll keep them as presented on version 3. Same with the PE teacher. And the only thing it looks like we are changing will be the ELL population band. We will remove that and put it back to 1-to-17. We will do the 1-to-1 paras, and then also the permanent sub.
That is correct.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, and this is not related to pairs, it is, well, maybe it is. It's about music at elementary. I'm seeing some red that I scrolled by and it caught my attention again. Where are we with music and in elementary? And yes, because I see music, I see art in black and then red, music crossed out, and then music back at one per school. What are we doing?
So that was just to clean it up because we had questions around the ratios, the way it was written. It was written as 1/art/music, and it was being interpreted that they had to choose one or the other, when actually they received 1 art and 1 music. So we just wanted to clean that up so it's clear. So you reiterify why we needed to do that. Thank you.
Okay. Sometimes you need to hear something more than once.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that gets us cleared here, and Ms. Boston Ellis will have to sharpen her pencil and let us know what the number actually looks like that we've approving this evening on that sheet right there that's on our screen. It's not going to be 5.3, but it's going to be close. So that will be up to us then to go to these whenever we're talking district staffing and where we're putting these people, and I know that's Ms. Boston Ellis's lane, so we'll have to have real conversations about where dollars are going to come from for this.
So with these changes and modifications, are we ready to move forward with this staffing plan for tonight agenda?
That's what I hear. We will make the updates. I'm going back to the office and working on those now, so they will be ready for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, if I may add to next steps, in addition to putting this on the board agenda, being mindful of our budget process. We have a lot of unknowns happening in Tallahassee right now, and so we would want to make sure that we're mindful of impact as we look at those dollars, not just separately, but in totality with those other impactful numbers. So the request would be of the board that we wait until the budget is finalized before we do anything to enact this moving forward, which is going to be underway in March and April. We won't have a final budget until probably April, Ms. Boston Elliott, correct? Yes.
Session is really late this year, isn't
So
So is the request that we approve this at this point, but not actually implement it at all? Is that what the request is? Because then I will ask so then I would question why we're having the conversation now, honestly. I mean, I understand why we're having, but I mean, if we're doing it so that schools can plan, but yet we're telling them they can't actually plan because of budget.
I thought that was the whole purpose of us having a special meeting. So we can
Right.
I understand what you're saying, but sit in my shoes for just a moment and reflect on this. As Dr. Gullett stated, there are so many things going on in Tallahassee, especially as it impacts the Family Empowerment Scholarship, and that expanding, and that has expanded exponentially in our district over the last 2 years. My request is we hold off on hiring anybody until April. If that is not the desire of the board, then I still think we need to prioritize things so we don't go out and hire $5 million worth of staff. I would request that we prioritize who goes first, second, and third. So I understand planning, I understand we're gonna hire teachers, period, and I understand there's some positions that need to be filled, but there are some positions that you are requesting that are supplemental in nature. They're to help the schools do better. And I would just hate for us to put ourselves in a position where we're forced to make cuts at the 9th hour. And that's what sort of troubles me about all of this. If it was a, perfect storm, this is it. And just to not to paint a dark cloud, but recall your requests in prior meetings about looking at staffing that is in referendum. what could be moved to the general fund, looking at the staff that we have in the ESSER funding, what needs to be moved before 2024. So I just feel like there's all of these different priorities going on, and they're wonderful and they're great, and there's things that we need, but what we need is a priority. What is the priority of our district? And then begin to fill positions based on those priorities. I know what Ms. Morant has to do, and I know what the schools need to do. We need to find teachers and staff before everyone else does. But I just think we're going to put ourselves in a not so good position until we look at the entire funding. I mean, from what I'm hearing, there is additional funding, but I'm also hearing things like family empowerment. I'm also hearing things like the retirement rate is going up, and there is always an expectation of health insurance going up. There is an expectation of salary increases. So there's a lot of things that need to be fixed in our district level staffing plan, which is a whole nother discussion that we need to address. And I'm probably talking too much, but I just think this is my opportunity to share my concerns with you. And I would feel remiss that I had done you wrong if I didn't speak up at this time.
Ms. Boston-Ellis, thank you for the transparency and the conscientious comments that you've given to us on this. So basically what we're hearing is that we're approving this, but we're not moving forward with it. This is just for planning purposes. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'll need some direction, because the allocations that we send to the schools, it's based on the allocations here unless we move with the previous one, and we are held to certain things. So as far as union contract, there are certain dates we have to give folks times for involuntary transfer. There's a transfer period, and that's why we were needing it for today to work through that. So if we're changing, or if we're not going to do the supplemental, if we are able to move with instructional at least, I would just need some direction, because we will need to back into like the career fair and things like that, that the schedule is built on based on different time frame and required posting. So I just would need that clear direction, and if we can anticipate dates.
So is the idea, Dr. Gullett, I'm trying to make sure that I'm understanding, since based on union contracts and all of that, that we needed to have this done today. I mean, we that's all we heard. That's why we're having a like emergency work session this morning to get this done for today.
And that was, just so I'm clear, that was based on the scheduled career fair of April 15th, and then backing back to those dates.
Right. But the concern is that if we post positions, and maybe I'm just totally missing this, but we would potentially post positions immediately after the board, this is hypothetically, immediately after the board meeting today for an August start date. Is that what?
Not immediately. So we begin with, and I can share this draft of the timeline as well. But first, after we get the allocations approved, we then send that initial allocation to the schools. We also know, we've put in this timeline, that we know the board meeting for the rezoning is February 28th, so we may have to send updates. And then from March 1st through March 7th is the involuntary transfer period for any potential displaced folks, and that will potentially come from the rezoning. Then in March 8th through March 10th, the schools are able to submit their instructional position requests and Skyward for that involuntary transfer period. Then March 14th through 17th, we have spring break. Then March 20th and 21st, so 2 days, our team will process that information. Then March 22nd through April 4th, the instructional positions are then posted internally for the voluntary transfer period. We have to do that time frame, that's required. April 3rd will be the last date to submit a position request in Skyward. That's for our schools if they are positions they want to post, and we'll have those ready for August, also in time for the scheduled career fair. And then April 5th through April 11th, instructional positions are also requested during this window to post externally as well. And then April 15th, we have the job fair. So we would need to, if we back some of that up, I just want us to all be on the same page. We'll need to back up the career fair so we can then work backwards into those required posting dates of the involuntary transfer and the voluntary transfer. Period.
And so what I heard, based on this timeline that Ms. Morant has so eloquently shared with us, the request is that we actually adjust the timeline entirely and not even begin the process until mid-March? I'm just, I'm not asking you, I'm
Okay.
sorry, I'm asking Dr. Gullett.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. So, Ms. Morant, but based on what you've shared, that process should be able to move forward, just pending finalization of the budget. If the board prioritizes these items, that's fine. Just know that we don't have the balanced budget yet, and there are going to be a lot of other moving pieces that need to be adjusted, which could have great impact. So I don't want to have that decision in isolation because there's a request from the CFO saying we have a lot of unknowns coming from Tallahassee and funding. But what you've shared can move forward, and I would hope, and we don't know this, that at that time when those positions are actually allocated to the school, that we may have the additional information, but there's no guarantee.
So there's a possibility that after we go through budget and allocations, that this still could change again?
It's a great question. I wouldn't say that it would change. I just want to ask of the board to consider, is this the final decision regardless of what the budget is from Tallahassee? That's really what I'm asking. We just need some clarity on that, right? I can almost feel Ms. Boston Ellis up here. There are a lot of unknowns. Right. So if it's the board's desire for this to be the final decision, that's fine. We just need to know that. But there are going to be a lot of other moving pieces, perhaps.
Vice Chair.
Thanks. And I appreciate all of the moving parts. At the same time, we have people that need to make decisions, kids that are going to be showing up. At the very least, I felt like this process, from my perspective, was to really hear and honor what's happening in our schools and try to provide accordingly. If there's any extraneous positions in what we just talked about, I certainly don't see them. I know that there are other budgets and other employees involved, but from my view, we're talking about getting the right people in the right positions to support our schools so that we can be more successful in our recruitment of teachers. I think about our homeschool liaisons and, other excellent support folks that are budgeted from other places where that money is going to dry up. I hope that we're focusing on trying to encourage as many of them as we can to become certified or out of field, and because they've proven themselves to be warriors, and let's get them teaching too. So that's where I am with this. I hear it, but we also have to provide a direction and stability so that our people know what to expect, and in uncertain times, that's difficult. So I appreciate you putting it out there, but at the same time, I'm ready to put on my, I don't know.
No, and Vice Chair, to your point, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I'm good, honestly, and I know that this is a lot. It's a lot, but we have money because of kids, and we've heard from our principals and from our staff that they need more support where kids are. Does that mean that when we get to district staffing, that we're going to have to sharpen our pencil immensely? Possibly. But where I am is we've done a lot of work over 3 meetings specifically about school support, and that's where our kids are. Does not mean that people who are sitting behind desks that don't ever see a child on a daily basis isn't also providing valuable support, or even a mechanic, or not meaning that those folks aren't providing valuable support to ensure that our kids also are receiving the ability to succeed. But we have done a lot of work to ensure that we're putting resources towards our students. That's where I am on it.
Go ahead.
I agree. I think this is a priority. Our schools are a priority. And that means we're going to have to find 5 million from some other bucket. And I appreciate that and understand that. And so, I'm prepared to continue to have the uncomfortable conversations. But if our schools need more support, that is where our students are, and that's where it needs to be. So it is a priority for me as a board member.
So I'm in the same. Let's move forward. We don't need to hold. We don't need to keep backing you guys up.
Right. And
You ought to be able to do what you need to do.
thank you, Reverend Cummings. Right now, we also understand that this is 5 million based on what our budgeted numbers are right now. And we don't know what that BSA is going to look like, and we don't know what,
Right.
we don't. It does appear that we'll have additional mental health dollars coming, specific in the FEFP allocations. I mean, it does appear that some of those things are going to be coming through, that there'll be specific allocations to impact some of these areas that we have increased, but for the sake of something else that they may be taking away from. So I understand completely that the conversation continues, and that right now this is, 5+ million that we're adding based on what we believe the number potentially could be. But we're kind of not, we're at a loss to know exactly what the legislature is going to do, and we're not going to know that in enough time for us to change all the work that we've done today.
Basically, excuse me. I'm sorry. So basically, we're saying please proceed, but there could be some other considerations in the future.
If there are,
in
bring
the
it to
future.
us.
If there are, then we'd have to deal with them at that time. But right now, we need to get you guys, I guess, on the right track to stabilize the district. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Thank you. Please understand, it's just a matter of being able to make sure the board is aware of all those factors,
Right.
and we have a responsibility to do that.
Correct.
And that number is not fixed. I anticipate there will be some change. We don't know what the change is, but that we don't go into that conversation without the board being aware. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
And I sure do appreciate that, as I said at the start. And I also know that it is our opportunity, and I believe it's February 21st, we'll be going up and meeting with our legislators and advocating and sharing that $5.3 million number that we have worked hard to direct directly to our schools for student success. We're not satisfied being where we are, and we appreciate their support. We appreciate the tax cuts, but we also appreciate all the money that's going to go towards public education and the economy that we're currently living in Florida.
Thank you. So with that, board, we'll go with comments and concerns. Attorney Powers, do you have anything for us?
Nothing from legal, thank you.
Ms. Martinez Lopez? Dr. James?
No comment.
Dr. Gullett?
Nothing additional, thank you.
Reverend Cummings?
Okay. Yes.
Vice Chair Thrower?
Just thanks again to everybody for hanging in and doing everything that we can to support our kids in our schools.
Thank you, and I'll wrap this up by saying, yes, second that. Thank you to all the hard work and those of you that have been with us today. Happy Valentine's Day. And with that, we're going to adjourn this meeting, and we will see you back in a few hours. It is right now 12:36 p.m. Thank you.